let me just say that we came together for this exhibition and the symposium inspired by the lessons that were imparted by the artists who, after September 11th, were tortured and imprisoned in dark sites around the globe and then illegally rendered to Guantanamo Bay Naval Station, now detention center, also known as the Gulag of the Caribbean. Their art has given us the opportunity to examine the ongoing impact of state violence and the consequences of extra-legal imprisonment at Guantanamo through the framework of art and law. We want to start out by thanking Martin Brinkley, the dean of the law school, who immediately offered his enthusiastic support, for which we are grateful. The Institute for the Study of the Americas and Beatriz Muñiz Rifkol offered so much guidance and support, as well as the College of Arts and Sciences, particularly Senior Associate Dean Elizabeth Engelhardt. We are so grateful to the many departments and centers that supported this event, including Art and Art History, the Institute for Arts and Humanities, the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies, the Center for European Studies, the Asian American Center, Beth Jacob and her organization, Healing and Recovery After Trauma, the Department of History, Communications, and Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, the Department of Women and Gender Studies, North Carolina Stop Torture Now, Sociology, Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and Romance Studies. We want to thank specifically Beth Jacob, Alexandra Moore, Erin Thompson, and Cullen Strawn for their help with the very important details relating to the art exhibition. I would like to thank Cynthia Lowry at the law school, who carried such great weight related to administrative details of this event, and Scott Barrier, who not only anticipated, but resolved our information technology issues before we even identified them. Scott back there. Finally, we would like to ask the students from my Human Rights Policy Lab and the students from Professor Chong's Art as Social Action to stand. We are so delighted to acknowledge the knowledge and the creativity that you have brought to this event. So please note that we have a break after the second panel and before our keynote speaker with some lovely refreshments. But I did want to, I can get to it, review with you the schedule for today. So we will have Dean Brinkley launch us into the symposium. And then our first panel goes from 3:20 to 4 p.m. That's history lessons. The road starts here. Our second panel, The Art Belongs to the Artist, from 4 to 5:15. And then we'll have the break 5:15 to 5:30 with lovely refreshments. At 5:30 to 6:15, we are very, very, very fortunate to have our keynote, Fionnuala Ní who is the former rapporteur on countering terrorism and human rights. And then last but absolutely not least, the panel on social action, law and art at 6:15 to 7. We know it's a lot, but there's so much important information about this event, about the people who have painted, have sculpted, and have really taught so much of us how to open our hearts to art and human rights. So let me introduce my dean, who will launch the symposium. Martin Brinkley is the dean and William Rand Keenan Jr., distinguished professor at the University of North Carolina School of Law. He serves as the faculty director of the UNC Law Institute for Innovation. He's a native North Carolinian and received his AB, summa cum laude in classics from Harvard University, renowned alum of our law school, and clerk for Judge Sam J. Irvin III, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and practiced corporate law for 22 years in Raleigh. And before I let him speak, I have to say something about my collaborator, Professor Chong Hong-An. Interdisciplinary projects can be interesting, can be challenging, but I've had the most amazing opportunity to work with somebody who is so brilliant, so talented, and has the moral compass. And I really appreciate working with you. Dean Brinkley.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and welcome everyone. It's a joy to see each of you this afternoon. When Deborah told me about her ideas for this symposium, it became clear to me that I needed to do some education of myself, particularly on the subject of art being produced by those who are incarcerated. Like lots of lawyers, I know a little bit about literature, and I knew about works of literature like King's Letters from the Birmingham Jail, Civil Disobedience, Henry David Thoreau, great works that were composed by individuals who were incarcerated for various periods of time. And I know a little bit about music. I thought in particular about a work that was composed by the French composer Olivier Messiaen called The Quartet for the End of Time, which Messiaen composed while incarcerated in a German prisoner of war camp in Poland in 1941, one of his most important pieces. But I am not a knowledgeable person where visual art is concerned. And so I set it about to prepare myself for this experience and began doing some research and learned that the largest unknown art culture in America, operating in parallel to the mainstream art system, is art being produced and created by prisoners, by incarcerated persons. That's according to the New York Times from last year. This symposium is an opportunity for people like me, and I'm sure for many of you who know far more than I do about the visual arts, to explore the intersection of art, law, and human rights. And it is a great privilege for us at the law school to co-sponsor this program with the Department of Art and Art History. The exhibit, as I think you all who have had an opportunity to view it already know, is of art produced by men who have been imprisoned or were imprisoned at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. It delves into the ongoing impact of state violence and the consequences of that at the extra-legal prison maintained at Guantanamo Bay through the framework of art and law. And I thought the best description of what we are here to do was one by our two leaders, which is that, quote, "We wanted everyone to see this art, see its beauty. We wanted them to see how we used our artwork to fight injustice." I'm grateful to you for letting me speak, and I look forward to our first panel. Thank you, Deborah.
So I'm so pleased to introduce our first panel. History Lessons. The road starts here with our presenters, Christina Calgar of North Carolina Stop Torture Now, and Lou Perez, J. Carlar, Citizen Professor, UNC Department of History. Dr. Calgar has been an active member of the progressive advocacy organizations for 45 years. In 2005, she helped found North Carolina Stop Torture Now, a grassroots network concerned about CIA rights abuses. As the state government refused to investigate the CIA's use of North Carolina airports for renditions to torture, Christina and other human rights advocates moved to establish the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture in 2016. The commission is the only state-level panel to seek transparency and justice for the U.S. post-9/11 torture program. She starts out by connecting the issues of today's symposium with the violations committed by the state of North Carolina and its relation to the U.S. program of extraordinary rendition and torture. In fact, we might say the road starts here, or perhaps we should say the flight paths start here, to human rights violations and the relationship to art as resistance and survival. This starts in our state. Lou Perez is the J. Carlisle Citizen Professor of History. His principal teaching fields and research interests have focused on the 19th and 20th century Caribbean with special attention to Cuba. His most recent book, Colonial Reckoning, Race and Revolution in 19th Century Cuba, was published by Duke University Press in 2023. He's going to provide us with an overview of the historical circumstances whereby nearly 800 men have been wrongfully imprisoned and denied any recognizable form of justice because of the U.S. control of Guantanamo Bay. Christine.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Deborah, for that gracious introduction. I'm really honored to be with you today, to be able to try to explain a little bit about why we're here. And let's see. Is that visible? Should we bring lights in front down a little bit if that's possible? If it's not, no problem. Is that better? Yeah, seems to be better. Thank you, Scott. So my job is to address why North Carolina. Why are we having this symposium here in North Carolina of all places? And what I want to explain is that North Carolina has played a crucial role in the US post 9/11 unlawful detention and torture program. And that program has targeted Muslim people all over the world. So in challenging the torture program, we call out the anti-Muslim basis for it and for the entire war on terror, which has focused exclusively really on Muslim individuals and Muslim populations in Muslim majority nations. And it's important not to lose sight of that. And the way that dehumanizing Muslim people has allowed the American public to look the other way at this program. So after 9/11, the Bush administration responded with the so-called war on terror, in which rounding up and interrogating hundreds of Muslims played a central role. And that program really took two sort of parallel tracks in correspondence with our federal bureaucracy. One, the Pentagon's overseeing of prisons such as Guantanamo, and parallel to that, the CIA, which set up a network of secret prisons and also utilized the torture prisons of close US allies such as Morocco. So what happened in North Carolina was that at Fort Bragg in Fayetteville, not far from here, personnel led by Colonel Morgan Banks took a program called SEER, the Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape Program, which was designed to support US personnel should they fall prisoner to foreign forces abroad to help them survive and escape. And they reverse engineered the SEER program to become a torture program to inflict upon Muslim prisoners. So they held a training program for military psychologists in September of 2002. And the focus was on how to overcome prisoners' resistance to break them down by using a combination of stress positions, threats with dogs, sensory deprivation, invasion of personal space by females, and other techniques in kind of a package. And when they had reverse engineered this into a torture program, they took it to Guantanamo first. And then from Guantanamo, they migrated it to Abu Ghraib in Iraq, and from there to Bagram prison in Afghanistan. And those prisons were all run by the Pentagon. Simultaneously and in parallel, the CIA was activating. It was setting up a network of secret detention sites called black sites, torture prisons. And these were places where detainees could be sort of disappeared to and held for months, years on end, with their families not knowing where they were, no contact with the outside world. The prisons were ostensibly secret. The Red Cross knew nothing about them, no lawyers. And there, they implemented a set of techniques designed to induce what they called learned helplessness, which previously had been used mainly on dogs. So you see that the majority, that there's a whole series of prisons here, and they weren't all in operation at the same time. From 2002 to 2009, there were 10 different prisons, and the majority of them were in operation between, say, 2003 and 2005. They were in Thailand, 4 of them in Afghanistan, and three of them in Eastern Europe, in Poland, Lithuania, Romania, 2 of them in Guantanamo, but not the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center that the Pentagon ran, but rather 2 black sites nearby where the CIA tortured people. So from 2002 to 2008, the Senate Intelligence Committee counted up 119 plus prisoners who were held in these secret CIA black sites. But they said there were a lot more. The record keeping was sloppy. They just couldn't document more than the 119. That Senate report was partially released in 2014, the executive summary, heavily redacted, but we've never seen the full report, which runs hundreds of pages more. At these black sites, the CIA conducted this program sold to them by a pair of Air Force psychologists who had never interrogated a single soul. And this program was truly barbaric. It included beatings, sleep deprivation caused by prolonged standing for days on end, stress positions, a variety of water tortures, prolonged loud music and weird sounds administered through headphones. And of course, in its ensemble, this was designed to drive people crazy and to break down their will. And it did that. So altogether, the Council of Europe termed this network run by the CIA and the Pentagon a global spider's web of extraordinary rendition. So there were staging points like North Carolina, like Langley in Virginia, the CIA headquarters. There were stopover points for refueling. There were pickup points where prisoners were snatched and rendered. And then there were drop-off points where prisoners were held and tortured. And then when somebody had been in the CIA black site system long enough, they were eventually, either they died or they were rendered to Guantanamo and became, their whereabouts became public again. So how does any of this relate to North Carolina? Well, I've already explained the Fort Bragg role, but the CIA used North Carolina as its staging ground for the aviation component of the program. And literally, renditions would not have gotten off the ground if it were not for North Carolina's airports. Our public airports hosted the torture taxis at Smithfield, which is just 45 minutes southeast of Raleigh, and also at the state-run Global Trans Park in Kinston, which is just about an hour further down the road. And these airports were absolutely vital to carrying out the program. So at Smithfield, Aero Contractors was and still is headquartered at the Johnston County Airport, which is a taxpayer-funded public airport. And that's been the case since 1979, but it was in 2001 that Aero was pressed into the rendition program because it was an asset ready to use. It's a North Carolina nominally private aviation firm that has just one client, the CIA. So it's a proprietary of the CIA. And N379P, also called the Guantanamo Express, was headquartered at the Johnson County Airport. It's a Gulfstream executive jet, and it was crucial in the first months and years of the program before it became burned. Too many plane spotters had identified it. So Professor Weissman's program identified very early how the county of Johnston and the airport facilitated and supported aero contractors with permits for construction, safety inspections, utility provisions, and then State Department of Transportation grants have been used by the Johnson County Airport to fortify Aero's corner of the airport with barbed wire to keep protesters out. In Kinston, the state allowed them to use the Kinston Airport rent-free while they built a hangar for a larger Boeing business jet. When the Gulfstream became too small and they had large numbers of prisoners, contractors, and CIA agents to ferry around the globe, they needed the larger runway in Kinston. And later, when they moved the Boeing out, North Carolina bought the hangar back from aero contractors. So the rendition project in London meticulously documented 62 rendition circuits run by the CIA. So a circuit involves multiple prisoners, multiple destinations in that global spider's web, and it can go on for 2 or 3 weeks. And North Carolina airports were the jumping off point, the landing point for at least half of those 62 documented rendition circuits. The New York Times made Johnson County's role in renditions public in summer of 2005. And North Carolinians immediately began raising the alarm, protesting, committing civil disobedience, calling on the state government to investigate, to not let us be involved in this immoral human rights travesty. And to this day, top North Carolina officials have studiously ignored that call. Human rights advocates have protested at the Department of Justice, at the governor's mansion. There's Deborah. At the Johnson County Airport, multiple protests there, nonviolent civil disobedience. Hundreds, thousands of petition signatures have been delivered to state and local officials, postcards, and nothing has been done. It is for them clearly a pretty hot potato. Delegations have met with the staff of 3 governors and 2 attorneys general, one of whom, Roy Cooper, is also a governor, and provided them with all available documentation as to Aero's role, as to the prisoners, exactly their identities, where they were taken, what happened to them. Several meetings with both Roy Cooper's staff and Josh Stein's staff, and none of that has resulted in a single public statement, even to say that torture is wrong and our state should not be involved in it. So citizens, despairing of official action, set up the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture. And Deborah mentioned this. This was a nonpartisan, blue ribbon panel, politically, professionally, and demographically very diverse. We had veterans, health professionals, legal experts, clergy, human rights experts on the panel, about half from North Carolina, half from out of state. And their expertise lent a lot of weight and gravitas to the investigation that was carried out mainly by staff, by volunteers. And we availed ourselves of all the information in the public record. We did public records requests to state and county agencies. And the process culminated with public hearings in Raleigh in 2017, where we had experts, academic specialists, psychologists with relevant experience. Ali Moore, who is here, did a tremendous job of assisting us with our research, preparing the report, and the law school clinics here at UNC, Deborah's clinic, and the one at Duke also participated in preparing this report. So it was a real community effort, and copies of it are available out on the table. It's really the only time that a state independent commission has interrogated the war on terror and has tried to hold the government accountable for the abuses in it. One of our witnesses at that hearing was Mohamedou Ould-Slahi, author of Guantanamo Diary, on which the movie The Mauritanian was based. And Mohamedou testified from his home in Mauritania, remotely. He was rendered by the CIA from Jordan to Afghanistan, and he testified that he was blindfolded, stripped, diapered, dragged onto the plane and shackled to it, and that the experience was, for him, the boundary between death and life. So the main findings of the commission, first, that the torture program post 9/11 still suffers from a glaring lack of accountability. For example, just one thing, there's been no study of the renditions that the CIA did to foreign allies, like to Morocco, where physically more gruesome tortures were performed on behalf of the United States. We know of at least 15 who were rendered by arrow to Morocco and other places, and were never counted by the Senate Intelligence Committee in their report. North Carolina played a larger role in the rendition program than had previously been known. Our airports supported more than 80% of identified renditions from the beginning of the program in 2001 to mid-2004, and North Carolina is complicit in at least 69 renditions of at least 49 people flown to torture. Also, renditions were integral to the design of the whole CIA torture program. They weren't just a means to transport somebody to a torture cell. The beating, the stripping, the drugging, the gagging, dressing in a jumpsuit, shackling to the floor of the plane, no communication, black-clad ninjas carrying it all out. This was all designed to begin the torture experience through terrorizing the person to believe that he was about to be killed. Also, torture continues to damage the survivors to this day, especially given the lack of acknowledgement and apology and restitution that they have experienced. So the damage from the torture is ongoing, and the damage to the US standing in the world remains. And finally, North Carolina officials, while they've ignored calls for action, actually have a legal duty to either investigate or to call for an investigation of these crimes, and to acknowledge and to explore providing redress. Since the Commission of Inquiry, North Carolinians have continued to call for accountability, to call for an end to the war on terror, which means closing Guantanamo. And in January, we joined hundreds of thousands of people around the world in calling for closure of the program. We were at the office of Representative Deborah Ross in Raleigh, and Representative Ross has a very safe seat, but she continues to refuse to say a single public word about the need to close Guantanamo. There's information about how you can contact her on the table outside. So finally, what can we do? We can contact federal officials. Tina Kaidenau is the person at the State Department who's charged with transferring people out of Guantanamo. Contact Biden, contact our US representatives, demand that they pressure the administration for closure of Guantanamo. We can email our state officials, investigate the torture taxis. Aero continues to operate with impunity from the Johnston County Airport. What are they doing now? We don't know. Write a letter to the editor, keep the issue alive. And there are websites for more information, which you can also find on the table out in the lobby. Thank you very much.
I need my hands. I need my hands. I have been asked to speak on Guantanamo. It's a long story. Begins with Jefferson, goes on with Adams, Monroe, Polk, Pierce. You know these presidents? Pierce. But I was given 15 minutes. So I'm going to begin with McKinley. So my question is, how do we know Guantanamo? How do we know Guantanamo? There may be folks here who come to know Guantanamo by way of Pete Seeger. Huh? Pete Seeger, Guantanamera. It was covered by Jose Feliciano, Jose Iglesias, Joan Baez. That's one way to come to know Guantanamo. Maybe you know Guantanamo from a Cuban film of 1995 by the name of Guantanamo, documenting the crisis in Cuba of the special period in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Or there may be some people here who know that Guantanamo is a Cuban city, a real Cuban city, founded in 1796. Population close to 250, 260,000. You have to go deep into the Google ecosystem, deep, to come across the first mention of Guantanamo as a Cuban city. It's not there. It's not there. It's been displaced. A shorthand, Guantanamo, what is the Guantanamo Naval Station? So Guantanamo has become this eponym for depravity and torture and hard times. A map of Cuba, please. Who's in charge here? All right. Thank you. What to say? Let me start with McKinley, 1898. What you all, or most of you all know as the Spanish-American War, let's be clear, the United States did not start a war in 1898. They joined a war in progress. The war was already in its third year and counting. And when the US arrives into Cuba in the intervention of 1898, the United States arrives in the guise of allies but stays in the role of conquerors. Cuba is considered by the United States as conquered territory. And that is the long history that begins with Jefferson and culminates with McKinley. Because, make sure I don't drop this, you see Cuba, when Jefferson looked at this map, what he saw was Cuba as the southern frontier of the United States, access in and out of the Gulf of Mexico, the Windward Passage, the Yucatan Straits. That is, Cuba becomes an item of strategic American importance. It is so important that the United States can't allow Cubans to have it. It was too important to allow Cubans to exercise the right of national sovereignty. So in 1898, the US intervenes in Cuba, seizes the island, signs a treaty with Spain in 1898, the Treaty of Paris, in which Spain, in classical colonial fashion, transfers the sovereignty of Cuba to the United States, along with Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines. And the problem is that Cuba has to be recognized as an independent, quote unquote, independent country. But the US wants a foothold in Cuba. And in 1901, the United States serves Cuba with an ultimatum. And the ultimatum is, you know what, if I could get a little more light, just a little bit, because I want to have a couple of quotes that I want to read in. Thank you so much. how to deal with Cuba, occupied Cuba, and extract from Cuba a concession for land to house a naval station. Because the US is sovereign of Cuba, but it needs to deal with a kind of sovereign country, an independent country, because it can't deal with a country that it's conquered and extract from it a concession while it is occupied militarily. So Cuba needs an independence, or facsimile of independence, to allow it to sign some agreement with the United States. And that happens in 1901 with the Platt Amendment, which defines the terms of Cuba's independence. The Cubans are told in 1901, accept the Platt Amendment as an appendix to your constitution, otherwise there will be no end to the military occupation, in so many words. The Platt Amendment, and I want to read a couple of these passages, has, for our purposes, Article 7 and Article 8 of the Platt Amendment, which is attached to the Cuban Constitution as an appendix. Attached into the organic document, the Magna Carta of the Cuban Republic of 1901, is the Platt Amendment that regulates and defines the character of this new republic. Article 7, and I'm quoting, that to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba, no pun intended, and to protect the people herself thereof, as well as its own defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States land, and I'm going to emphasize this, necessary for coaling and naval stations. And Article 7, that by way of further assurance of the government of Cuba will then take this item and transfer it into a permanent treaty, okay? Which is beautiful, because this document in the Cuban Constitution has no legal status. It's an appendix to the Cuban Constitution. So Cubans were obliged to sign a treaty before Cuba had its independence under the military occupation of the United States. In other words, let me put this in simple terms. The United States invaded Cuba, conquered Cuba, seized the territory, and then asked Cuba to sign an international treaty to ratify what had already been seized. And indeed, the Permanent Treaty of 1903 ratifies the Guantanamo Naval Station. Article 1, the Republic of Cuba hereby leases to the United States for the time required for the purposes of coaling and naval station. Article 2, the granting of the foregoing article should include the rights to use and occupy the waters adjacent to said areas of land and water, and generally to do, and I emphasize, to do any and all the things necessary to fit the premises for use as a coaling or naval station. Only. Only. And for no other purpose. Let me read that again. To do all the things necessary, and I'm quoting, all the things necessary to fit the premise for use as a coaling or naval station only, and for no other purpose. That treaty of 1903 was ratified in a new treaty in 1934. Which says, 1934, the lease to the United States lands in Cuba for coaling and naval stations only. That treaty is still in effect. So by the topic and the theme of this event, the United States is in violation of a treaty to which it's a signatory in 1934. It's in violation of a treaty. And the Cuban government, since 1959, has called attention of the United States to this violation of this treaty of 1934. Ha. We can look at a number of iterations in the history of the Guantanamo Naval Station. In a trajectory of empire, how adaptable, how perfectly adaptable the Guantanamo Naval Station is as the empire moves through its multiple phases, through its multiple expressions. Iteration number one. Indeed, a coaling station, a naval station, from which to extend US hegemony throughout the Circum-Caribbean region and to support military intervention. And if you could take a look at a map, the Guantanamo Naval Station, oh, I'm sorry, I have a pointer, where you see Santiago de Cuba there in the eastern right ends, the Guantanamo Naval Station, I think it's marked right there, there. I think that's it right there. That's Guantanamo Naval Station. That's Guantanamo Bay. Look how perfectly situated it is to launch military operations against the Dominican Republic and Haiti in the interventions of the 1910s. Think how close it was to the intervention in Mexico, in Veracruz. Think how close it was and it served the purposes of US intervention in Nicaragua. So that's iteration number one. This is kind of where the Caribbean becomes a closed sea for US interest between, let's say, the Roosevelt Coral area through the 1930s. Iteration number two, Guantanamo in the Cold War. With the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the new Cuban government demanded the restoration of territory seized in 1901. Again and again and again. The Cuban government has asked for the return of territory seized in 1901. The United States leases and pays the Cuban government every month a paycheck for the use of the naval station. The Cubans haven't cashed a single check since 1959. They have not cashed one. And so the naval station becomes a place during the height of the Cold War where the US monitors Soviet activities in Cuba, supports directly and indirectly covert operations against Cuba. And it's ironic, those of you who know the geography and the relations with Cuba, the US, and the Soviet Union, that this map doesn't have Cienfuegos, but Cuba had the unique status of having two naval stations on its south coast. The US naval station in Guantanamo and a Soviet submarine base in Cienfuegos along the same southern coast. And I'm sure they kept an eye on each other. The third iteration is Guantanamo in the 1990s, where Guantanamo becomes a detention center, what to do with all these Haitians that are leaving because you just can't let them in. What to do with all the Cubans who were leaving the island in the 1990s in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so the United States decided it was going to demagnetize the Florida Straits, and in the crisis of the mid-1990s, sent a flotilla of naval ships to block Cubans from seeking to reach Florida, just outside the 12-mile limit. And who was president in 94? Anybody remember? What, Clinton? Yes? Yes, somebody say something? Yes, I don't know. So they demagnetized the Florida Straits, but magnetized the 12-mile limit because Cubans knew, oh hell, we don't have to get all the way to Florida. All we got to do is get to that flotilla that's outside the 12-mile limit, and 200,000 Cubans just roared up and entrusted themselves to the US naval presence. What to do? Put them in Guantanamo Naval Station, and off they went. And they were there for several years until eventually all of them were pardoned and returned and allowed entry to the United States. And the Haitians were not so lucky. The Haitians were returned. And then the fourth iteration is the prison camp, which is why we are all here today. After September 11th, the US government authorizes the Naval Station to set up a maximum security facility. And Guantanamo moves into this anomalous status. Is it sovereign territory? Is it Cuban territory? What's the jurisdiction? All of a sudden, the legality of this gets murky and foggy. I'm keeping to my 15 minutes, Deborah. So what to say? This is a long history. It is in many ways a sight. It's a microcosm. It's a prism through which you look through when you see light refracted in many different directions, a way to take stock of an empire in formation, its culminating, its rise, and whatever follows next. It is, in other words, a way that we take measure of a culture, that we take measure of a people, the way we take culture of a history, and the way we take culture of a standing, of the words that govern daily life, and the actions that serve or not to give those words meaning. Thank you for your attention, and I hope everyone has a wonderful and informative symposium. Thank you.
My name is Thomas Betts. I'm a second-year law student here at UNC. I'm a student in Professor Wiseman's Human Rights Policy Lab, and I have the honor and the privilege to introduce our second panel. This panel brings together several former prisoners and survivors of the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, with human rights scholar Alexandra Moore and attorney Mark Mayer to share their stories of art making as a form of protest and as a necessary process for survival. Alexandra Moore, professor of English and Human Rights and the director of Human Rights Institute at Binghamton University of New York, is the author of 2 monographs and 8 edited collections. Among them is a recent work co-edited with Elizabeth Swanson titled The Guantanamo Artwork and Testimony of Moath Al-Alwi, Deaf Walls Speak. Today she'll be sharing an excerpt written by the artist and published in that book. Sabri al-Qurashi, a former 13-year prisoner at Guantanamo Bay, originally from Yemen, now faces harsh conditions in Kazakhstan. After his release from Guantanamo, the American government sent him there, where he lives without documents or basic rights. He began creating art under the difficult circumstances of Guantanamo, and now he finds himself in a similar situation. For Sabri, creating art and drawings are a means of steadfastness and expression. Pakistani citizen Ahmed Badir Rabbani spent 18 years detained in Guantanamo Bay. After 2 years in CIA custody, he arrived at Guantanamo Bay in 2004. His art, featuring empty tea sets and empty plates with missing chairs, evokes both the emptiness of missing his family and the hunger strikes he endured in protest. Released in February 2023 alongside his brother, Ahmed returned to Pakistan with minimal support. He lacks access to much of his artwork and resources to find employment or care for his family. A former Guantanamo Bay prisoner for over 14 years, Mansour Daifi is a writer, artist, and human rights advocate. Unjustly imprisoned without charges, he was released in 2016 to Serbia through a US-Serbia agreement. Since then, Mansour has dedicated himself to rebuilding his life and advocating for others. His journey is remarkable. In 2001, he earned a bachelor's degree in management with the thesis title, Rehabilitation and Integration of Former Guantanamo Prisoners into Social Life and the Labor Market. His research fueled the creation of the Guantanamo Bay Survivors Fund, co-founded by Mansour alongside US attorneys and NGOs. Currently pursuing a master's degree in project management, Mansour is also a published author. His memoir, Don't Forget Us Here, Lost and Found at Guantanamo, garnered recognition from the New York Times, The Guardian, and other major publications. Currently serving as treasurer for Healing and Recovery After Trauma, attorney Mark Mayer is a lawyer with a history of representing Guantanamo detainees. He litigated Gold v. Biden, which resulted in the first win for Guantanamo detainees in a habeas case in a decade. We're incredibly lucky to have this panel here with us today. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you so much. Is the mic okay? I'll try not to unplug it as I walk around. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much to Deborah and to Hung An, to be here with my heroines, Fionnuala and Christina. It's really such a pleasure. I'm just going to speak for a few minutes and tell you about a recent project, but I kind of have to settle into it a little bit. So I'm thinking about where we just started with the two maps with North Carolina and Cuba. And obviously we know we are where we are, but I'm going to talk about Moath Alawi, an artist and a current prisoner who's there right now. And so I always have to take a moment and to think that I'm speaking because he can't speak to you. And I want to show you a little bit more of his work. There's a beautiful example, the gondola out in the display case. And when you look at it, I hope that you stop and think about what it means to create something out of nothing in your cell with detritus from the prison, and put that together and make it into an expression. And how sad it is that you have me instead of him. But nonetheless, I'm honored to be here. So I'm speaking about this book that we just published. And I'm very, very bad at promoting things, but this I'm trying to get better because for me, this is all about Moath. So along those lines, I've convinced the publisher to discount it for this month, and I have those coupons, and know that any penny that comes from it is all being held for Moath. So again, that's our gesture. It's not the book that Moath would want, right? It's not the book that Moath would want. I'm an academic, and I'm writing a book with someone that I cannot meet, I cannot speak to, I cannot communicate with indirectly. Like it would be illegal for us to pass notes back and forth that would endanger the people who are cleared to speak to him. So it was a very laborious process, but nonetheless, the centerpiece of the book is an essay that he wrote about his creative process and what it means to him. So I'm going to read a little bit of that, just a few minutes to give you a sense of it. And then the other chapters are from a fellow detainee and artist, Mansour, who I was just letting him know we're starting a little early. So he'll come on. He has a chapter in the book. Belinda Walzer, who's here, has a chapter in the book. Other academics talking about what it means from an art history perspective, Islamic art perspective, all different perspectives to think about Moath's art. What would Moath want? I've never met him. I've never spoken to him. But I think what he would like is an art book with big, beautiful photos of his art where he can tell more about them. So a couple of images, and I think it's fine with the lights. These are ones that are all in the U.S. have gotten out of Guantanamo. So some of the art has a freedom that he does not have. The irony of that is not lost on him. There are these, 3D things. This is the one that's in the display case, gondola, the ark, giant, which I'll talk a little bit about. You can see some of the close-ups. There are only a couple slides. You can see, for instance, on the right, can you see the bottle cap that is the helm? Right? So you have to start to look in a different way. The ropes unraveling his t-shirt and coiling them. I don't think I have the anchor is something cut up. He would task the guards with cutting things up for him. And this is a photograph that I couldn't put in the book because it's not high enough quality, but it's an amazing photograph And I had never seen it until recently. This is Eagle King, and he built the case for it as well. So I'm not sure if I'm supposed to show you that, but anyhow, I did. So we'll back up. I'll leave it here, and I'm just going to read you a tiny, tiny bit from his chapter to give you a sense of it. And now we probably need the lights so I can see. Thanks. Thank you, thank you. So Moath, not Allie. The first thing I noticed when I entered the cell in 2010 were its deaf walls, with no window for air or sunlight, no way to know if you are under or above ground, or to distinguish between day and night, as if you were in a grave and everything alive got disconnected. I paused in the middle of the cell, confused, thinking of home, the old life, agriculture, greenery, plowing, and all the tools that recall our ancient heritage, the axe, the sickle, the water wheel, the old mill. Old, beautiful things, especially arts and crafts, attract me to meditate and to think without feeling, an essential skill in this place. I have to make these deaf walls speak. This was the beginning of a journey that was full of thorns. At Guantanamo, my beginning was not that of an artist who establishes his artwork with brushes and paint and a natural vision. It was bitter and difficult. And the main reason I started was because I could make others hear my voice and my pain in this place. This exile in which you feel that you are imprisoned on another planet or at the bottom of the ocean, in complete darkness where no one can see or hear you. Loneliness, estrangement, sickness, pain, all in a place where conscience is absent, where everything is outside the law in the country of law and freedom. And before I talk about a couple of the works, I'll just say that Moath was transferred to Guantanamo in the first week of the prison's existence. So January 2002. And he's never been charged with a crime. And he's been cleared for release since December 2021. Yeah, there he is. Here he's talking about the Ark. I've never been on a ship, but everyone knows its shape. Our prophet Noah was able to rescue people and animals with a ship when the earth was flooded. So a ship expresses rescue, and that is why I love to build ships. The other thing that attracts me about ships, sailing ships, is tradition and heritage. Each ship contains art and creativity. The most beautiful thing happened the first time I made the sails and tied the ropes. I felt as if I were in the middle of the ocean. I felt waves hitting the ship from every direction, and I felt I was rescuing myself. One day I was tired and lay down on the floor next to the ship. The fan blew air onto the sails, and the ship started moving. Yes, the ship itself is the rescue. And then he talks about gondola and how he made it, and then he goes on to giant. After finishing the gondola, I worked on giant, which was my fourth sculpture. I had pictures in my mind from a program I had watched in Guantanamo about a ship called Ghost, an old ship that sank in the ocean and became inhabited by ghosts. It appeared that next to the ship was a woman working on it, and she seemed to be talking to the ghosts. She was communicating with them, asking them to move the rope or line, and the rope moved. This surprised people, and they began to believe the ship was haunted. We feel the same here in Guantanamo. We are ghosts here. You can see us, but you cannot talk to us. We used to look at the horizon from a window in the camp. We could see ships from far away, and we wish we were on board those ships. We stole glances at the ocean when they moved us from camp to camp. But now I can see the ocean from my cell. The ships I make talk about the violence of the ocean. The ocean is violent. It does not know any mercy. The ocean where we are now is always violent. We are suffering here. We are on board that ship. and we are fighting the challenging waves. We are on the ship, but we hope to reach the shore. I've been searching for justice and freedom for the past 20 years. I'm over 40 years old, and half of these years I have spent in prison without ever being charged with a crime. More than 20 years have passed, generations have died, and new generations have been born. Every day passes, and I remember hearing the voices of children, the new generation, and I hope to see and sit with them. So thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me? I can't see you. I think that Uncle John won't let me to turn my camera on. Oh, so you have bad IT guy. I can't hear you guys. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, finally. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يا هلا مرحبا حبا حياكم الله حبا باللي جاء يا مرحبا باللي جاء. Welcome to Guantanamo, guys. I can't I can't show my face. I'd like to scare you a little. You might take a look at the worst of the worst.
So, Sabri and Badr, can you hear me? And Ed, can you interpret?
سيد صبري سيد أحمد عم تسمعونا؟
نعم أنا موجود أسمعكم صبري.
Yes, Sabri is
معكم.
able to hear us.
Okay, Carolina, start us off with the first question. And this first question is addressed to Mansour, Sabri, and Badr.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. It's wonderful to speak with you. So our first question is, what inspired you to create art while imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay?
سيد صبري السؤال لك والسيد أحمد عم تسأل الكل شو اللي ألهمك بغوانتنامو تطلع بهالفنون أو شو اللي خلاك تعمل هالأشياء الإبداعية بغوانتنامو الإلهام؟
السؤال لي ولا موجه لمنصور ولا البدر ولا
لا
أحمد؟
لا أي واحد منكم، أي واحد حابب يجاوب. إذا عندك جواب تفضل.
طيب أظن بدر إذا موجود. أحمد.
I will answer that question. First of all, thank you all for being here today. And the song I started with is actually the Guantanamo song we used to sing for each other at Guantanamo. It's art from Guantanamo. And before I start, I'd like to thank Fionilla. She has played an important role for lifting the ban on art from Guantanamo. As you know, that Trump administration banned art from leaving Guantanamo. I'd like to thank all Guantanamo lawyers, Antbeth Jacob, Alka. I'd like to thank also Aaron Thompson, Alexandra More, and everyone who contributed the art journey from Guantanamo and after Guantanamo. And just last week, we had an art exhibition at the EU Parliament, and now I'm still drafting my article about the art exhibition. It was amazing to see the art that was classified as at Guantanamo to be exhibited at the Hall of Power. What motivated us or what to make art at Guantanamo? Because they kicked our asses there, guys. First of all, honestly, being detained and tortured and abused, I heard some of the guests were talking about the black sites, and I think Bad should be talking more because he spent a long time in those black sites. When we spent a long time in solitary confinement, isolated from the rest of the world, tortured, abused, denied access even to look at the sun, at the beautiful blue sky, and we had nothing. We absolutely making art before 2010 was forbidden, and anytime we would make art, we get punished. If anytime we would sing or dance or try to express ourselves, we would get punished. So in 2010, when Obama failed to close the prison, they reviewed Guantanamo and they made some recommendations. One of it was the art class. So we had been deprived for a lot. And when we started making art, the things that we missed most, like seeing the sky, sun, sea, flowers. We painted our hope, pain, love, death, and everything. You know, art is not just a stroke of on paper. It's part of us. It is actually help us to survive, to resist, to express ourselves. It was our way to escape from the feeling of being in Guantanamo. So we entrusted our tears, our hopes, our dreams, our pain to those paintings. So it was a piece of us. Art connect us to our memories, to ourselves, to our lost humanity. So I took a long time. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
هلا أجيب على نفس السؤال أو
Shall I translate? Should I answer the same questions or something else?
لأن
Same
أنا
question.
كتبت.
نفس السؤال سيد صبري.
طيب لأن أنا كتبت هنا عندي تحت بعض الأشياء. طيب أولا يعني أشكركم على استضافتي ويعني منحكم يعني منحي الثقة عندكم. أتكلم وترجم مباشرة أو أتكلم وأسكت؟
اتكلم واسكت. خليني يعني احكي شوي طويل وخليني انا اترجم. First of all, I would like to thank you for hosting me and for giving me your trust.
نعم. السؤال ممكن تعيد لي السؤال مرة أخرى بس حتى
السؤال هو شو اللي خلاك انت وحضرتك بجوانتنامو، شو اللي خلاك تشعر بالالهام او شو اللي خلاك تطلع بفكره الاعمال الفنيه هي؟ ليش قررت تبلش تعمل اعمال فنيه هي؟
طيب عندما يعني الإنسان يكون أو يجد نفسه محاصر في مكان ما مثل السجن أو يعني أتكلم في وضعي، أنا كنت في السجن محاصر يعني ومغلق علي كل شيء. هنا يعمل الخيال والفكر. الخيال والفكر يعمل دور كبير في تخطي محنة السجن.
So when someone finds himself under siege in a place like the prison, as you know, I was in the prison. I was not allowed to have anything. And in cases like this, imagination and thinking start to have a huge impact.
فيحاول الشخص المسجون أو المحاصر الهروب من واقعه والتعبير عن ذاته والحنين إلى الحرية. كل هذه الأشياء تجعله عنده رغبة في الإبداع أو إخراج ما في داخله.
So the person imprisoned, he tries usually to run away from the reality by trying to express himself and trying to imagine freedom and trying to create something different.
نعم، كل هذه الظروف تجعله يعني داخليا يحاول يخلق أعمال مثلا إبداعية أو فنية تتناغم مع معاناته وينتقل فيها إلى مساحات أخرى غير السجن اللي هو عايش فيه.
All those circumstances create a statement or create something that make the person trying to come up with some creative and artistic artwork that make him away from all the prison and what he's suffering now.
نعم، هو الخيال.
It's all about imagination.
Yes, انتهيت.
And thank you very much for that.
شكرا.
Thank you so much. Our second question for all of you is, could you tell us what it was like creating art under the conditions of imprisonment?
السؤال الثاني موجه لكلكم. فيكم تحكوا لنا عن الصعوبات أو كيف كانت عملية إنشاء الأعمال الإبداعية في ظل ظروف السجن والصعوبات اللي بترافق إنشائها بالسجن؟
منصور تفضل.
أنت يا صبري تفضل.
لا خلي عندك أنا خليني أنا أكتب أكون عندي بس وقت.
Basically, like making art at Guantanamo. Imagine you are sitting on the beach, or like listening to your headphone music, listening to Taylor Swift or wherever, or with your artist, and like smoking your cigar and enjoying the. No, Guantanamo wasn't like that. Basically, you will be dragged from the chain shackled, get like harassed, searched because the guard don't want you to go to the art class. Most of the time, you're not allowed to take anything with you. Bad searches, because the guard moving the prisoners back and forth, it's a lot of work for them. That's what one thing. Humiliation. At the same time, at the art class, you will be chain shackled to your desk, to the floor, being monitored by cameras. There is limited of time, limited of supplies, and while making art, some of the paintings would take weeks, months, maybe year. And while making that painting, you don't know if it's going to approve, it's going to be stamped, or going to be confiscated and sentenced to death. So basically, when you finish with your painting, you send it to the art teacher, who will send it to the class officer, to Guantanamo Task Force, again to another department, join the detention group, and they have to search, decipher the paintings, check if there's like hidden message or a message of imminent threat whatsoever. It keeps you like nervous, and you have only your hope, and you have to adapt to the situation. So making art was really hard itself, a process. Making one painting and get approved, it's like you got a new baby coming to life. If your painting was confiscated and disapproved, you will never see it again. It's a death sentence. That's it. So it was we had honestly like some very good art teacher who was very supportive, very helpful to the artists, and he played a major role in getting art out from Guantanamo and get the paintings approved and stamped. As you look at each paintings has to be stamped, numbered, and so on. So that the process of making art, it was part of Guantanamo itself. It's not like it wasn't that easy, getting the art supplies. I remember once they stopped the art supplies, and Badr, who was with us today, he had some spices, as like Pakistani like spices food. So his family sent him some spices and coffee, and he started mixing this stuff and start painting, because take everything from Badr except from his art supplies. So I'll let them to finish the story. And this is the art process. It was the struggle and suffering. It was piece of Guantanamo, basically.
Thank you. Sabri, if he would like to answer, we'd love to hear that too.
سيد صبري إذا أنت حابب تجاوب كمان.
على راحتكم أنتم اللي
حابين يسمعوا.
جيد، أعيد لي السؤال معلش مرة أخرى حتى.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sure. Could you tell us what it was like creating art under the conditions of imprisonment?
فيك تخبرنا عن الصعوبات اللي واجهتك في خلق أعمالك الفنية بسبب الوضع اللي أنت كنت فيه بالسجن؟
نعم. بالنسبة للإبداع الفني في السجن، هو يظهر بأشكال متنوعة طبعا، مثل الرسم، الكتابة، موسيقى، والحرف اليدوية. تفضل.
Creativity in prison usually is manifested by different types, such as drawing, writing, handcrafts, or music.
نعم. وهذا كله يعكس وهذا الأداء كله يعكس في الإبداع، غالبا في تجارب الحياة الصعبة اللي الإنسان أو المشاعر اللي يمر فيها.
Usually this is reflected by or this usually all of that represent all this creativity represent the hard conditions or the hard experiences, and also the feelings that we are facing during that time.
وهذه هي وسائل للتعبير عن الأمل والمقاومة.
Those are means to express our hope and our resistance.
وكذلك التخفيف الضغط العاطفي والنفسي اللي يمر فيه السجين.
Also reducing the emotional stress that the imprisoned is facing.
وتحويل الألم والعزلة إلى فن.
And convert the pain and isolation into art.
وكذلك يلقي الضوء على قضايا اجتماعية وإنسانية مهمة له في داخل السجن.
And also shed some lights on some humanitarian and other causes that is faced by him at the prison.
نعم، تفضل. شكرا.
And thank you.
Thank you. Hello. So as art has been a part of your survival process in Guantanamo, do you see art making as a form of resistance? And if so, how?
السؤال هو على اعتبار انه الفن صار جزء من حياتكم في غوانتنامو، هل كنت تشوف انه الفن هو جزء من المقاومه او جزء من مقاومتكم للواقع اللي انت كنت عايش فيه؟
I think we should give space to Ahmed. يا بدر.
سيد
Okay.
بدر سيد بدر عم تسمعنا؟ حضرتك معنا سيد بدر؟ I don't think he is with us.
He is there.
He's
أحمد
there.
يا أحمد
أحمد.
unmute yourself. أحمد افتح الميكروفون حقك.
سيد أحمد إذا أنت على الميوت، إذا حابب تحكي افتح الميكروفون لحتى نقدر نسمعك.
Okay, I will jump on this. Basically, you know, in places like prison, art become like a life necessity there. And yes, of course, as part of form of resistance, because it's not just resisting the oppression and dehumanization, demonization in the prison, but also resisting not to lose your humanity, not to lose your hope, not to lose yourself, because the moment you are in prison, like in Guantanamo, we had no shared life with each other, and there was barriers. And the more you stay in the prison, the more your brain would start to construct a new you, a new life, a new memories, a new talent, a new knowledge, a new emotion, a new relationship, a new everything. So if you let yourself in that vicious circle of violence in the prison like Guantanamo, where we just reacting to whatever they throw at us, that means the more you stay, the more you are distanced from who you are, from your knowledge, your memories, your relationship, your everything, basically. So being able to make art, we start making art at the early days, even like in Camp X-ray. And it's not just painting or drawing, singing, dancing, poetry, and you name it. And it became like so beautiful, because imagine 15 nationalities, they came with different mindset, different background, different cultural, different artistic talent, and that arrived at Guantanamo, interacted, melt, and created Guantanamo culture and Guantanamo art. So being able to paint, to connect yourself to through your memories, to escape the prison and to stick to who you are as a human being, but also to express yourself to the world outside, to challenge the capture narrative and about you. Because as you know, Guantanamo, they deemed us like the worst of the worst terrorists. I remember the first time we asked the camp administration to allow us art class, they laughed. They said, "Your guys are terrorists. You didn't know how to paint." So I had to ask some of the brothers to paint and to show them. Also, going to the art class was a challenge to start developing yourself, develop a new talent. That's a form of resist to not to bury yourself in the prison life in jail, because you know you could in a prison, you could just exist. There is no life within you. But if you resist, if you will try to learn, improve yourself in a place that try to destroy you, this is a form of resistance. Even after Guantanamo, like the art, as you know, the Pentagon in 2017 threatened to burn art from Guantanamo. And now art speaks on behalf of the prisoners of Guantanamo, become a voice to represent Guantanamo and Guantanamo prisoners.
So,
Yeah,
excuse me.
thank you.
We're going to try to have Ahmed Badr Rabbani speak via this phone. Ed, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear me.
Okay, would you ask Ahmed the following question, and we are going to try to have him respond via the phone and the microphone. So the question is, as art has been a part of your survival process in Guantanamo, do you see art making as a form of resistance, and if so, how?
سيد أحمد مرحبا. السؤال هو على اعتبار أنه ممارستك للفن كانت جزء من الشيء اللي أنت عم بتقوم فيه للنجاة أو لقضاء حياتك في المعتقل، فهل تجد أنه الفن هو وسيلة للمقاومة أو وسيلة للنضال؟
Yes. Badr, Ed just translated. Could you hear him?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you answer?
No, I didn't hear by Arabic. No Arabic.
Okay.
Arabic question.
All right. Let me see if we could try this another way.
سيد أحمد عم تسمعني؟ سيد
Yeah.
أحمد؟ Okay.
Global technology and other.
If you can't hear the speakers, have you got it on?
It's just Ahmed.
Yeah, but we have no other way of getting.
Yeah. Ahmed, we cannot get the interpreter through the phone. So.
سيد أحمد عم تسمعني سيد أحمد؟
No, if it's started, it's okay, or I will hear them.
Okay,
I mean,
that
they
sounds
do
good.
Conversation with each other.
But your artwork is has been moving through, so at least we have that.
I wish I can talk with them, but I tried. It's unmuted it. It's not. I couldn't. I will
So-
go back to Zoom. Okay.
Ahmed, we
Yeah.
can understand you.
Yeah, but
And we also have somebody here who can speak some Arabic, who's going to speak to you through the phone. So don't go away. Don't go away. Stay on the phone with me.
right. I want to stay with you in the phone.
ألو مرحبا. سيد أحمد معي؟ اسمعني؟
نعم. اسمعك.
أنا جاي أترجم لك السؤال.
تفضل.
هلا هم بيسألوك ولما أنت كنت بغوانتاناما حسيت إنه الفن وسيلة للدفاع عن نفسك وعن حقوقك لو للنضال عن هاي المواضيع؟
أي طبعا بالحقيقة يعني هذا اللي خلانا نبدأ، لأنه ما عندنا أي نشاط ولا عندنا أي اسمه ذا ولا أي حاجة نعبر فيها عن مشاعرنا عن الظلم اللي كان حاصل علينا. فلما وجدنا هذه الوسيلة طبعا تحمسنا. في الحقيقة يعني كان أكثر واحد حمسني صبري. يعني صبري كان كنت عايش أنا معاه في نفس العنبر، كان ما شاء الله نشيط. كنت يعني أول من يعني حمسنا على هذا الموضوع صراحة صبري يعني.
تمام،
فعلاً
خليني
يعني
أترجم لهم عشان هم يسمعوا جوابك كمان بس ثانية. So he says that, of course, art was one of the only ways they could fight for themselves and to protest. And actually, like when they found that they can do art and they use that as like a way to speak for themselves and have a voice, they got really excited. And one of the people who made him very excited about art and start art was Sabri. He was very active and very just like a fun person to work with. And he got him started on art. So he's very thankful for that. في شيء تاني بدك تضيفه؟
نعم طبعا كان في البداية يعني كان مهزلة، كانوا فقط يعني عرضوا علينا الرسومات هذه بأوراق سندوتشات وألوان اسمه ده ألوان شمعية وأوراق سندوتشات نرسم عليها ويعطونا لون واحد فقط، ياخذ العسكري اللون ويعطينا لون آخر، الين كانوا يعني يطفشونا يعني يريدوا يزهقونا، ولكن الحمد لله ناضلنا سنوات حتى وجدنا بعض التسهيلات عن طريق المحامين، جابوا لنا مدرس جديد وبعدين الحمد لله بدأنا.
تمام. خليني أترجم هلا. So he says, and it wasn't easy. They tried to make them get bored of like asking for art and art supplies. They started with giving them sandwich papers to draw on and just crayons, one color, and like limited hours, and like it was all calculated so they can stop asking for it. But they kept protesting and asking for more, and they never like put that down. So, and then they got lawyers and they got a teacher, and it just got better from there. شيء تاني؟
فقط هذا السؤال الأولاني.
تمام يسلموا. He says that's it.
Okay. We have another question or two for all three, and then we'll continue the same way.
Hi, everyone. Our next question is, what does the art from Guantanamo bring to the field of human rights?
سؤال موجه لك سيد صبري. شو الشيء اللي بيقدمه الفن لحقوق الإنسان، الفن القادم من غوانتنامو وحقوق الإنسان؟
طيب ممكن أجاوب على السؤال اللي قبله أو نعدي السؤال هذا اللي
Can I ask the question before this one or I answer this one?
لأنه السؤال هل يشكل الفن الصناعة المقاومة أو مثل هكذا؟
Because I wanted to answer the previous question.
Oh, yes, please answer the previous one too.
اتفضل. اجاوب على السؤال اللي قبله وحابب اجاوب على هذا كمان.
نعم، اجاوب على السؤال هذا باختصار اللي قبله واجاوبك على السؤال الثاني. بالنسبه للفن، هل يعتبر يعني شكل من اشكال المقاومه؟ نعم، الفن يعتبر شكل من اشكال المقاومه، وكذلك يعني مهم جدا ولا يعني يقل اهميته عن المقاومه مثلا بالقوه او غيرها، فالفن نعم يشكل شكل قوي يعني من اشكال المقاومه.
So can we consider the question as a part of resistance? Yes, it is a very important part of the resistance there, and it is as important as resistance by force, and also make our life better there.
نعم، لأنه بالنسبة للسجين هو طبعا ما يملك القوة حتى يقاوم أو يقاوم عن الظلم اللي فيه إلا يعني إبداعه وفنه، فهو يعني يرفض الظروف القاسية والظلم اللي يقام عليه اللي يعني يمر فيها السجين.
Since the prisoner usually does not have the force to fight back the injustice that he's suffering, so creativity is his way to reject the harsh condition and the injustice that is suffering.
نعم، ويوجه رسائل للجميع يعني عن طريق فنه وإبداعه يوجه رسائل حول العدالة وحقوق الإنسان.
And through his art, he delivered message to everyone about human rights and about justice.
نعم، فهو يستخدم ألوانه وإبداعه وخياله في يعني إظهار الظلم اللي هو فيه، يقاومه بالإبداع والفن.
So he used his colors, his art, his imagination to resist this injustice and to show to people how unbearable those situations are.
نعم، كما أن الفن يعتبر يعني الفن وسيلة للبقاء على قيد الحياة، يعني أو على يعني في داخل السجن والحفاظ على هويته الشخصية كذلك.
Also, art can be considered as a survivor mechanism and to keep one's identity.
نعم، وكذلك يشكل مقاومة داخلية للسجين حول ظروفه القاسية.
Also, it can be considered as an internal resistance for the prisoner against his current conditions inside the prison.
نعم، شكرا. هذا السؤال اللي قبله طبعا. السؤال الثاني.
Thank you. This is for the previous questions, and for this question, my answer would be. تفضل سيد صبري.
نعم، السؤال الثاني ممكن تعيده لي حتى.
If you can repeat the next question for me, it would be great.
Yes. What does the art from Guantanamo bring to the field of human rights?
شو الفن الموجود من غوانتنامو بيقدم للحقوق الإنسان؟
نعم. أولا هو يقدم أشياء كثيرة في حقوق الإنسان أو في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وهو يؤثر إيثار يعني تأثيرات إيجابية في ذلك يعني في حقوق الإنسان.
It provides many things for human rights, and also it has a huge positive impacts on human rights.
يعني من ضمنها التوعية والتعليم.
It's all about raising awareness and also educating people.
نعم، يساهم الفن في زيادة الوعي بقضايا حقوق الإنسان من خلال التصوير الظلم والاضطهاد والعنف بطريقة قوية ومؤثرة.
So art contributes in improving awareness towards human rights, and by portraying what the unjust and the harsh conditions that people are facing.
كذلك التعبير والتأثير.
And it's all about expression and influencing.
فالفن يعكس قصص وتجارب ومشاعر الأشخاص المتضررين من انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان.
Because it reflects the stories and the experiences of people who were impacted by the violation of their human rights.
ويساعد على إبراز الجوانب الإنسانية وتوليد العواطف كذلك.
It also helps in highlighting the human aspects and raise emotional support for those people.
وهناك شيء آخر كذلك هو يعني التغيير والتحفيز.
It's also encourage people to change and also motivate them to try to do that change.
فالفن يلهم الأفراد والمجتمعات للتحرك نحو التغيير والعمل وتحسين الأوضاع.
So art inspires people to move towards the change and try to do something to change the current situation.
نعم. وكذلك المقاومة والتحرير.
And also the resistance and the liberation.
لأن الفن أحيانا يستخدم كوسيلة للمقاومة والتحرير لأنه يعبر عن الثورة التي داخل نفسه.
Art can be used sometimes as a way for resistance and liberation because it presents the rebellion or the revolution inside the person's mind.
كذلك الفن يؤثر في حقوق الإنسان لأنه يلهم الآخرين ويشجعهم يعني يشجع الأفراد والمجتمعات على اتخاذ إجراءات عملية لدعم حقوق الإنسان.
Also, its influence had a huge impact on human rights because it encouraged whether persons or communities to take urgent measures to improve the human rights conditions.
نعم، عبر المشاركة في النشاطات النظامية أو دعم المؤسسات والمنظمات ذات الصلة يعني.
Through participation or through supporting the relevant NGOs.
شكرا.
And thank you.
Mansour, would you like to answer that question as well?
Yep. Yeah, Sabri already covered some of the aspects, but also basically like, you know, art challenge the culture, secrecy, and silence surrounding the Guantanamo. As you know, the Guantanamo is one of the most secretive prisons in the world. So art coming out from there, challenging this kind of secrecy. Also, it serves as, this is really important, as a form of documentation and testimony of Guantanamo, shedding light on the human rights abuses and injustice, you know, happened within the wall of Guantanamo. It actually, people can look into what happened there through the paintings. It's documentation, it's a testimony, it's a witness to what happened there. And it's also, empowering people to speak out, to break the silence, and to stand for what's right. I would like just to add this. More importantly, it also humanizes the prisoners within Guantanamo. And I said before, as you know, the Guantanamo, like the government narrative, dehumanizing the prisoners. But if you look through the artwork, you can actually look into their souls. So that what the government tried to shut down the art from Guantanamo, because actually it counter the government narrative. Yeah, thank you.
So هلا السؤال إلك بحكي لك
أي نعم.
إيش بيجيب الفن اللي عملته أنت بجوانتانامو إيش بيقدم لحقوق الإنسان برأيك؟
والله يعني الفن يعني بيقدم لحقوق الإنسان أوضاع الناس في غوانتنامو، بيشرح للناس أوضاعنا في غوانتنامو، الظلم والمعاناة اللي التي عانيناها، وألوان العذاب. احنا يعني بننزل الألوان هذه اللي بتنزل على اللوحة، هذه ألوان العذاب وألوان المصايب اللي كنا نعيشها، والحرمان والأشواق لأهالينا وأطفالنا والحرية. هذه اللي نعبر فيها لحقوق الإنسان.
Give me a second. أعطيني ثانية شوي. So he says that the art that he does and he did in Guantanamo gives a lot to human rights because it opens up the conversation about these prisoners, about what they have been going through in Guantanamo. The colors on the painting reflects the pain that they've been going through, the torture, their feeling of wanting closure and wanting missing their kids and their families. Every stroke and every color reflects feelings that should be had a conversation about. تكمل هلا؟
نعم تفضلي.
بدك تضيف شيء ثاني على الجواب؟
اي طبعا يعني حقوق الانسان بالنسبه باللوحات هذه، يعني في البدايه كانت يعني جاءتنا تساهيل نستطيع يعني نعبر فيها عن مشاعرنا. بعد كده يعني حطمونا، منعوا إخراج لوحاتنا ومنعوا لنا الألوان، وكانوا يعاقبونا على بعض اللوحات، ويعني يصادرون ألواح ويسرقون لنا لوحات. ما وجدنا حقوق الإنسان يعني حقيقة.
تمام. So he adds on and says that at first, the painting and drawing was to make it just not as rough in there, but then they start to take that away. So even that is a conversation about what is human rights and what does that mean to them, because they couldn't find it there. شيء تاني بدك تضيف؟
لا إذا عندك سؤال آخر ممكن.
تمام يسلمك. He says that's it. Yeah.
So that actually leads really well into our next question, which is about your ownership and your ability to keep your art. And we know that the United States government policy has changed over the time that you all were there imprisoned. And we just want to know how that affected you and your ability to take your art with you upon leaving the prison.
هلا السؤال سيد صبري عن الملكيه وابقاء اللوحات معك. هلا احنا بنعرف انه الولايات المتحده غيرت سياستها فيما يتعلق بهالاشياء هي، ففيك تحكي لنا على موضوع لوحاتك واذا حسنت تاخذهم معك والتجربه عموما؟
بالنسبه للوحاتي انا استطعت اخذها، يعني طبعا انا اخذت لوحاتي لانه انا خرجت في بدايه 2015. نعم استطعت اخذها، وكان في ذلك الوقت يعني ما كان في تشديد مثل بعد 2015. طبعا هو كان في تشديد، كان في خوف اني ما استطيع اخذها، ولكن كان عندي يعني خوف شديد جدا اني ما اخذ لوحاتي، وكان في احتمال قوي جدا انني ما اخذ لوحاتي. تكلمت مع المسؤولين هناك، أو بالأصح عندما أنا كنت خارج قبل الخروج ب3 أيام، تكلمت مع المسؤول المعسكر كامل وقلت له يعني إما أن أخرج أنا ولوحاتي أو أبقى أنا ولوحاتي.
So in terms for my paintings, I actually managed to take them out with me. As you all know, I left the prison in 2015, and back then the policy was not as strict as it is now. After 2014, after 2015, one of my fears was that my inability to take those paintings with me, and there was a possibility that I wouldn't be able to take that with me. So I have talked to all the officials inside the prison for almost 3 days, and I told them specifically either the paintings and I leave this facility or I will stay with them.
نعم. طبعا لأنه كنت قبل أن أغادر من السجن، يعني كنت أسمع عن طريق العساكر أو الجنود أنه احتمال ما تأخذوا لوحاتكم هذه لأنكم لا تملكوها. يعني اللوحات هذه والألوان والأوراق وكل شيء تستخدم في الفن هذه ليس ملك لكم، لذلك ربما تبقى، وإذا في حالة خروجك اللوحات تبقى وأنت تخرج. طبعا كان هذا شيء يعني كان بالنسبة لي مخيف جدا، يعني لأني أنا كنت أتعامل مع لوحاتي وكأنها يعني أطفالي، يعني مستحيل أغادر بدون أطفالي يعني.
So before leaving, I was hearing from the soldiers there that there was a possibility that I wouldn't be able to take those paintings because I don't own those paintings since they are providing the papers and the colors and everything else. So I was not able to claim ownership of those paintings. So that was a very low possibilities, but it was there. So I was really afraid because I consider my paintings as my children.
نعم طبعا، لأنه حصل وأنهم صادروا مني تقريبا، يعني أنا يعني حقيقة ما يحضرني العدد، لكن ربما من 80 إلى 100 لوحة صدرت مني قبل الخروج يعني بسنة تقريبا.
Because they confiscated some paintings. It happened before. They confiscated around 80 to 100 paintings.
نعم. في الأخير في النهاية يعني طبعا هو البقاء اللوحات عندك كان يسبب لي خوف شديد جدا إني أفقدها في أي لحظة من اللحظات، ولكن يعني أشكر الله وأحمده أني عندما خرجت ووصلت إلى البلد اللي أنا الآن فيها، فلما فتحت الشنطة وجدت اللوحات موجودة.
So keeping the painting with me was really my concern. But thankfully, when I arrived to the destination country, I opened my bags and I found that the paintings were still there. Thank God.
نعم. شكرا.
And thank you.
Thank you, Sabri. Mansour, did you want to answer that question?
Yeah. I feel sorry because I couldn't see my face in your big screen. So, you know, that question is reflected on the first one because, as you know, Guantanamo was created outside of the legal system, outside of our humanity, outside of the law. While in Guantanamo, you have no rights. Sometimes we would demand the animal rights. They said no. Said, okay, what about the devil's right? Because they said you are devils. So because in Guantanamo, whatever you have, it doesn't mean like the food, the clothing, the medicine they gave you. It doesn't like it's your right. They said, we give you this as kind gesture of us, not like you didn't deserve all of that. So the battle of the ownership of Guantanamo started really early. Even the letters that our families sometimes would send us letters and photos and they would confiscate it. I was like, this is mine. No. You have nothing here. You know, most of the letter will be redacted and they would give us just a copy of the letters, not the originals. They will keep the original for themselves. Even those copies, we're not allowed to keep them, I have them. In 2013, because as you know, if you read in my book, the golden age started in 2010, where we had access to TVs, newspaper, magazines, PlayStation, everything, art classes, and so on. In 2012, the army came to replace the Navy, and they didn't like the way of life we have in the prison. They said, we need to take control. So in 2013, they shut down the communal living, and they destroyed a lot of the artwork, confiscated. They confiscated draft of my book. They destroy a lot of artwork of Sabri, others. We created also sculpture from cardboard, a lot of objects, everything was destroyed and confiscated. So, and the battle or the fight for the ownership of the staff of the writing in Guantanamo started even before 2010, because sometimes prisoners would write poems, stories that would be confiscated, and sometimes we would get punished. You know, during Obama era or Uncle Obama, we were allowed to send art to our lawyers, to our families. My lawyer managed to take my paintings, and but when we exhibit the art in 2017, created by Aaron Thompson, you know, the Pentagon said no, that the art belonged to the Pentagon, so they banned the art. We started again to fight for the release art from Guantanamo. I would protest, I wrote articles, we wrote a letter, collective letter to Biden, and until, you know, the United Nations with, thank you for your intervention. So they said, okay, the prisoner would allowed to take a practicable amount of, I love American how they phrase things. They have a special way of phrasing things. They said a prisoner would be allowed to take a practicable amount of paintings. Basically, the first prisoner who was allowed to take art with him was Badr, here as he with us today, and they confiscated even 60 paintings of his artwork. Those paintings, he painted about his time in the black side, the way he's torture, abuse, and so on, because they know this kind of painting, they know it can be used as testimony, documentation, because especially if what they did, they actually approved those paintings approved by the US government. And imagine the painting came out, painted in Guantanamo, about what happened in the black side, approved by the US stamp, it will be very powerful. So they confiscated that. Again, silencing, censorship under the name of security, and so on. So the battle of now, for example, one of the paintings was published in the Miami Herald 2008, what like a journalist said, a jihadist casted those into culture. So basically that painting was painted, one of the painting was painted in the interrogation room, where also interrogators use art making to interrogate prisoners, you know, test them to see what kind of prisoner they are. So those painting would be classified as secret. So welcome to Guantanamo. Guantanamo to upside down world, guys. Trust me, it's not, and it's still going until now. I mean, we are not going to give up on this battle until Guantanamo is closed and until the art is released from Guantanamo.
Thank you, Mansour.
السيد أحمد في كمان سؤال لك.
نعم.
هلا لما يتعلق الموضوع بملكية وحقوق الملكية للفن تبعك اللي عملته بجوانتاناما، هل تملك كل الحقوق الملكية ولا خسرت بعض من رسوماتك، أو كيف الرحلة مع هذا الموضوع بالذات معك؟
ايوه طبعا في البدايه في السنوات الاولى قبل الاضراب، يعني من عام 2011 الى 2013 كنا بنرسل لوحاتنا طبيعي مع الصليب الاحمر الى اهالينا، وعن طريق المحامين الى اهالينا، وكان ما كان مقاصدنا يعني حقوق انسان واعلام ومن الكلام هذا، كان يعني فقط احنا نفرح انه ايش اهالينا يعرفوا انه عندنا احنا عايشين ونشاطاتنا بتوصل اليهم، ويعني كنا نحس انه ما زلنا نقدم شيء للحياه. ممكن تترجم الكلام هذا؟
هلا بترجم. So he says it's a very long story and it starts like about copyrights, and it starts with everything being normal. They were allowed to, before the strike 2011 to 2013, they were allowed to send like paintings with the Red Cross to their family, to their friends, and that within itself did not have any political like ideas behind it or strategy. They just were very happy to share something with the world and to feel like they're active society members. But yeah. All right.
طيب بعدها عندما حصل الإضراب قاموا حطموا لنا أكثر اللوحات، خاصة اللوحات المهمة يعني اللي تدل على التعذيب أو على أشياء زي كذا. كانوا حطموا لنا هي وكسروها وقطعوها وأخفوها صادروها. المهم سلمت بعض اللوحات خرجت إلينا بعد تقريبا 2015. رجعت مرة ثانية مارست الرسم بعد 2015 2016، كنت مضرب كانوا مانعيني من المدرسة. بعدين خرجنا لوحات فتحوا في معرض في نيويورك. رجعوا بعد كده منعوا اللوحات، إخراج اللوحات تماما من جوانتنامو.
تمام. So then after that, there was a strike that happened and they destroyed most of the paintings, especially the ones that were almost politically charged, that we're talking about torture or anything. They destroyed most of these paintings. Some of these paintings survived, but mostly not. And he was banned from taking any more art classes probably because of like his paintings. And then he got back to the classes in 2015 and started painting again.
طيب بعد كده لما منعوا لنا إخراج اللوحات، طبعا هذه الفترة تحطمت معنويات الواحد، يخاف يرسم، خاصة لوحاتنا بتنسرق وبتتصادر يعني كثير لوحاتنا الغرفة بعد في التفتيشات بياخذوها علينا وبتختفي، خاصة لوحات التعذيب، لوحات التعذيب ولوحات المحاكم واللوحات التي يعني تدل على المناضلة وعلى القيود، على الحرية. هذه اللوحات اختفت من عندي تماما، أكثر من 50 لوحة اختفت من عندي تماما.
تمام. Then after like painting resumed almost, there was this one time that they were allowed to have their paintings sent out to an exhibit in New York. And for some reason, right after that exhibit, they were like not allowed to have any more paintings. And they would search their rooms for specific paintings and destroy the painting. And if they caught one of the paintings, they will never see it again. So they became very terrified of like drawing because they wanted to own their art and they wanted to have it, but that like if it was found that they draw that did not mean good news.
مع ذلك كان عندي أمل يعني إنه أحصل على بعض اللوحات واستطيع إخراج اللوحات إلى المحامين. لكن بعد كده لما صاروا حتى إحضار اللوحات إلى غرفة المحاماة عشان نوريها المحامي، كان المحامي يكتب بعض يعني يشوف اللوحة ويكتب وصف ويخرج الوصف هذا، حتى هذا منعوه علينا. فلما منعونا هذا الكلام تحطمت نفسيا، ما عثرت أرسم. ولكن بعد خروجي وعدوني بإخراج جميع اللوحات، جابوها أمامي. اللوحات الباقية اللي عندي كانت تقريبا إلى 500 لوحة. ولكن لما خرجت هنا تفاجأت إنه كثير من لوحاتي غائبة، ما هي موجودة، يعني بعد في السفر أخفوها مرة ثانية.
So after that, he still had hope. He wanted that to keep drawing and maybe someday he will own and have like the rights to his own art. But then right after that, like they would use some like kind of technique. They would like show their artwork to lawyers, and then the lawyers would take notes and describe what they see so they can share it with the outside world. But then they prohibited that. And once that happened, he was completely destroyed, like, and he didn't want to like paint again from that point. But when he was released, they promised him like all his paintings back, but he discovered when he received, it was not all of his paintings. So some of them were missing during the transportation of that, but at least he has some of his art now. إيش تاني تضيفه؟
اي نعم، لكن مع ذلك يعني انا لو كنت اعرف انه يعطوني هذه الكميه من اللوحات كنت 2 توقفت عن الرسم، كنت برضه حرسم. يعني لو اعرف انه كانوا يعطوني هذه الكميه كنت حرسم، لكن حقيقه ما كنت متوقع انه يسمحوا لنا باخراج اللوحات، فهذا الذي حطمني يعني اكثر شيء. مع ذلك الحمد لله يعني خرجنا من فم الاسد بايش؟ بشويه من فم الاسد على قولهم.
So he goes on and say that if he knew that he would come out with some of his paintings and this amount of his paintings, he would go back in time and draw. And then like he spent 2 years not drawing because he was very disappointed. He would go back and draw so he can have more of his art now. And that's what like is like kind of eating him up. And he's very grateful and thanks God for the paintings that he owns right now. إشي تاني?
لا فقط هذا.
He says thank you.
Thanks. So just a quick news update, which is that I was able to go to Guantanamo in November, and I posed 2 questions about the art program, which I had to submit through official channels. And when I was flying here today, April, the Department of Defense wrote me back. So you can attribute these answers to a Southcom spokesperson. And like Mansour said, that detainees can take a practicable quantity of their artwork back. That's all I had known before. I just figured it was worth posing the question again. And they added, this is determined on a case-by-case basis on the conditions of the transfer. That policy allows for the detainee to take with them model ships if desired. So that I think is news, which is amazing because that Eagle King blurry photo, that's still there. And then I asked if there are still art classes and they said the detainee art program is provided by a contract instructor that meets, let me see this exactly, that meets contract criteria. Detainees continue to have access to art supplies and have the option to work on pieces in their cells, communal and recreation areas. So that was this morning.
Basically, they have like they didn't have like the art teacher, but they have someone who, like play a role of art teacher. Someone like just attend the class, provide them with the art supplies and in the art class. Yeah. But like it's honestly it's a crime against art in general. What they use government confiscating, destroying art, stripping those prisoners from their intellectual, their ownership. It's a crime against the government, and we should sue the government. You should sue the government, guys, because we cannot. I would, but they won't allow us.
Can I just, can we give a round of applause to Leah Abed for thank you for stepping up to be our translator, in-person translator. Thank you so much.
And if I could just say, when there are treaty body oversight committees, sometimes they have these events called diplomacy dialogues, and they often take the United States to task for the fact that we only speak one language.
Can I steal that mic? Wait, is this one still working? Oh, it is. Okay. So hi, everybody. I'm for some reason the person that was saved for last. The phrase that was coming up into my head as I was sitting there was a tough act to follow, because I really can't imagine that there are many of you who are listening to those brilliant, well-spoken, thoughtful survivors and artists and thought to yourselves, I really can't wait to hear from that socially awkward lawyer who keeps looking back at the crowd to see how many people there are. But for those of you who were thinking that, the next 10 minutes are going to be, thrilling. And I would like to first thank you all for having me here. My name is Mark Mayer. I'm an attorney who has, at least in the past, represented a number of men in Guantanamo. And I'd like to also thank Moath, Sabri Badr, and Mansour for letting me share the time with them when they're really the people who have something to say. And to pile on the self-deprecation before this picture gets up here on the screen, I should note that I'm not the attorney who's supposed to be here. The person who was supposed to be here is a really incredible advocate named Beth Jacob. And if we could get the lights for this one. A really wonderful advocate named Beth Jacobs, who's represented Guantanamo detainees for decades at this point, and I know that the other men who were speaking on this panel can attest to the importance of the decades of her work. So I am sorry that she couldn't be here, but I will try to power through and do as best as I could. And before I get speaking and before the picture that I want to talk about gets up here, I want to note that I'm going to be bookending my comments with some thoughts from a client and a friend of mine, Khalid Qasim, who is still detained in Guantanamo and has been for about 22 years without charge or trial. I believe he showed up at around the same time that Moath al-Alwi, who you heard some words from, did as well. And he is, like many of the men remaining, cleared for release from Guantanamo, but if or when that is going to happen is a mystery. And as I was sitting there, I thought of all these things. You see, I've written some things down, and I thought of all this stuff I should have written down. And I promised myself I'm only going to deviate from what I've written 2 times, so you won't hear me yapping too much. But I was really inspired by one of the students who opened up the speaking, talked about the importance of framing. And I know that they were talking about framing of visual work, but I did think about how so often when we, especially American lawyers, talk about the detainees at Guantanamo, we talk about the things that have happened to them, that have been done to them by Americans, the torture that they've experienced. And I'm sure you've heard from Mansour, these men are so much more than that. They're funny. They're really funny. And so a little story about Khalid. One of the first times I met him, I mentioned him. I do not speak Arabic. I've tried to take some classes, and I told him I was taking classes. And he said, oh, that's, one of the things that Americans can never do is say my first name right, because we don't have that sound in English. And he said, so you practice it with me. And he said, Khalid. And I was like, Khalid? And he was, no, Khalid. I was like, Khalid? No. And we went back and forth a little bit. And finally I said it one way, and he said, okay, great. And I said, oh, did I get it? And he said, no, but I'm bored. And that's what Khalid is like. You probably see pictures of him from when he showed up in 2002, and that's such a bad representation of what this man is, because when I see him, he has this huge smile on his face. That's how I think of this man, not as the mugshot that you all have seen. Anyway, this work that is behind me, it's 9 different candles that Khalid painted. And it's probably a little bit different. No, you can see it here. But it might be a little bit difficult to see that each of these is really, really textured. There's a lot of detail in the actual canvas. And that is because he actually painted these candles on gravel and dirt from the prison itself that he had glued together. And there are 9 of these candles, and these candles represent 9 men who've died in Guantanamo and are meant to be viewed as a series. And also part of the reason I showed this is because Khalid would be angry at me if I did not show some of his art while I was talking about him. And hard as it is to believe, he actually painted these almost 7 years ago. And even though he has continued to work prolifically since then, they still represent a large percentage of his work that has been released. Now, I and a few other attorneys have been lucky enough to see some more of his art, the vast majority of which remains in Guantanamo. So why is it that most of the work of this incredibly talented man is still sitting piled up in Cuba instead of traveling the world? Well, that's because the process of getting art out of Guantanamo and ensuring that it remains the property of the men who created the art has a long and complicated history. And so I'm going to try to give a brief legal history here. It won't be too detailed, I promise. So the men and frankly boys who were detained in Guantanamo have been creating art since its earliest days. They initially used food and tea leaves as paint, and they would make etches in the styrofoam cups. Those early works were considered contraband, rounded up and destroyed. But after years into their detention, the policy changed. Detainees were permitted to create art and allowed to have their art transferred out of the facility through the ICRC or through counsel. But I should note, as you've already heard explained, that the art still had to undergo a review by the US military that was, to put it mildly, opaque and confusing. You can imagine what this meant for the men who had for years been left voiceless. During those years, the only people who listened to them were their torturers, interrogators, or from time to time, a sympathetic American military member or attorney. Now the world could hear them. Their art could be displayed in galleries or sent to their families, undermining the idea that these men were, as Mansour put it, the worst of the worst. But again, this changed in 2017 with an abrupt change in policy. There's a full ban on the release of detained artwork that was put into effect. Part of this ban still remains in effect. While the released men have been allowed to leave with some of their art, the men who are still detained are unable to give their work, either the originals or copies, to their attorneys for release. Throughout these changes, attorneys for the men have complained to anyone in the US government or at civil society organizations or the management involved in the management of Guantanamo who would listen. I can go through the legal bases for these arguments at length, but that would put you to sleep. And so I will just summarize by saying that in American prisons, and according to both Army regulations and international law, both prisoners in America and prisoners of war are supposed to be able to leave detention with their belongings and with the art that they've created. There isn't really any debate about that. The law is not unclear, and it's not as though if those who are responsible for making those decisions, the people who run the State Department or the Defense Department, or even the people who run Guantanamo, are unfamiliar with international law, or really, probably more specifically, the Army's regulations. So, what gives? This is one of the other places that I'm going to allow myself to riff a little bit. You may have heard that Guantanamo was designed to be a legal black hole. And I'm going to borrow a little bit from what Dr. Perez was saying about the idea of sovereignty. This is by design. This isn't accidental. The reason why these men were sent to Guantanamo is kind of summed up in the arguments that the United States made in the case Boumediene versus Bush, which I encourage everyone to read. I think it's thrilling, but I am, a lawyer and a nerd and everything. But part of what the United States was arguing was precisely what Dr. Perez was saying, was although the men were saying, we have certain rights under the US Constitution because you have detained us, the United States said, sorry, but this isn't the United States. And you're not United States citizens, so the Constitution doesn't apply. Where are you? You're in the sovereign jurisdiction of Cuba. Despite the fact, now I've been to Guantanamo quite a few times, despite the fact that when you're there, you'd think you're in an American suburb. I've sent postcards from Guantanamo with American postage stamps. There is American mail that happens there. There's a McDonald's, there's a Subway. All the products that you get there are American. When you go to the bars, they're serving American beer there. There's American music playing everywhere. I met very few people who spoke a lick of Spanish while I was down there. The US's argument was basically the same argument that I make about making changes to my apartment. My landlord won't let me. I'm sorry. And in one of the few really good decisions that I think the United States Supreme Court has made is they agreed that that argument was pretty ridiculous. They made a distinction between de jure and de facto sovereignty, a difference between by law and by fact, that even though this is technically under the sovereign jurisdiction of Cuba, let's be serious, this is America. America has control over it. And while the Constitution doesn't apply in full force, it's one of the few places where a little light shone through and where there was a recognition that these men do have certain rights and that they're not completely outside of the law. And this actually is only one example of what it's like to be caught up in that legal black hole's gravity. The lawlessness and the arbitrariness is the point. And I know that I and others appreciate that there are people in the US government, and yes, even among the Gitmo administration, who have had the decency to allow detainees to bring their art to attorney meetings, or to even let the art leave the prison. But this is the point of having laws, of having rules. A person's rights shouldn't depend on which commander happens to be assigned to the prison. They shouldn't depend on who Americans decide they're going to vote for. And they shouldn't depend on who a president appoints to a cabinet position. But this is exactly what Gitmo was designed for, to keep these men outside of the protection of the law, subject only to the changing whims of whomever happens to be in control at the moment. And don't doubt that that arbitrariness has an effect. We attorneys would see it firsthand. I remember very clearly in meetings with Bader, who you heard from, when he was still detained, sometimes he'd be permitted to bring his art to show it to me on a Tuesday, and on the Wednesday, he wouldn't be allowed to bring it. I would see that my attorney notes describing the art I seen one time when I went down there would be clear for release. I could talk to you about it. I could have brought copies of it right now. A few months later, would have been classified as secret. So what changed? Did the camp authorities get together and change their operating procedure? Did a message come down from state or defense? Or did the UN get together and change the rules governing the treatment of prisoners? No, what happened was there was somebody different looking at my letters, or there was a different guard that showed up to transport Badr. What was the remedy for us? Make a complaint, send it in, an email out that in all likelihood would get ignored. But even black holes give off a little bit of light, which we call Hawking radiation. So I guess it's not all in vain, right? Although sometimes it feels like we're shouting into a void, the work of countless attorneys, advocates, and most importantly, the men themselves has had an effect. The fact that we're here today and that we're able to hear from Badr, from Mansour, from Sabri, it means that there is light that is breaking through. So in keeping with that, and to continue helping to elevate the voices of the men still detained and to keep myself from yapping anymore, I want to close by sharing some thoughts directly from Khalid Qasim. I was able to speak with him yesterday, and without a lot of warning, I asked him, do you have any thoughts about your art to share with these people? And this is really pretty close to word for word from him that he said off of the cuff. And this is what he said. So in general, I need you to focus on the struggle of producing art. That's the main obstacle. It's not as easy as some people may think, especially as time passes. It's been 22 years. As time goes on, it seems like it's getting more complicated in terms of our release. There were the Trump years when it was known that no one was leaving Guantanamo. And now, some 8 years later, we're inside because of a conflict that's outside. In general, for the last 8 years, it hasn't been easy to produce art. And, you know, that's exactly when I started. I only started making art at all in late 2016. I just started learning and Trump took over. That was an obstacle, especially for me. I went through a lot of protesting for a long time during the Trump administration, and mostly by myself. You know, asking the question, why am I here in this cell block by myself most of the time? Ever since that time, 2017, producing art is not that easy. It's not because I was sad or down. It's because painting was something that felt pointless. Because you know you were not leaving. The art is not seeing the light. If they are not seeing the light, then why would I paint? Also, there was the lack of means of learning how to make art. I struggled to learn even the basics, like mixing colors. These both together made me stop painting altogether. I spent quite a while altogether not producing anything. They call it artist block sometimes, but for me, it was an artist's mountain. And this can last a long time. But yet I started to produce some. So what made me push through that mountain? I always have hope, always. That's something that never left me. There is some day when I will be released. And hope, it's a conviction that's built in me. Also, I know that art is one way that I can communicate with people. When I leave, inshallah, the art that I make and hear will help me communicate with the outside. Yes, it's a means of communication. Also, one more thing. I want to stress that the impact of the imprisonment, it impacts my body, but it never impacted my spirit. Words like hopelessness, despair, they don't exist in my spirit's dictionary. Thank you.
So we want to thank everyone for, thank you. We want to thank everyone for your patience with the language and technology issues. But I cannot say how impactful it is to hear from everybody on the panel and how grateful we are to Sabri and Badr and Mansour. Your art, your words, your contribution today, I think is just meaningful and impactful, and we're so grateful. Yeah, he's on.
Yeah. بحكوا لكم كتير شكرا عشان انتوا اجيتوا وحكيتوا معنا وإنه أنتوا كلماتكم كتير مهمة وملهمة، وآسفين كتير على المشاكل التقنية مع اللغة والترجمة، وبس كتير كتير إحنا بنشكركم وبنقدر تواجدكم اليوم معنا. Said he wanted to answer another question or something.
Yes,
I think it's muted.
yes, go ahead.
عهد الرئيس بايدن التغيير الأخير في السياسة نواصل الحكومة بملكية أعمالك الفنية، هل يؤثر ذلك عليك؟ هذا السؤال أنا حقيقة هو اللي يعني من الأسئلة اللي عجبني جدا. حقيقة يعني أنا أعتبر هذا ملكية المطالبة بملكية حقوقنا هو تمثيل، يعني في تمثيل حتى إضلال الناس عن حقوقنا الأصلية. يعني لما الحكومة الأمريكية تضيع من عمرك 21 سنة 21 سنة دمروا صحتي 10 سنوات مضرب عن الطعام، وبعدين يجي يقول لك ملكية أعمالك الفنية، يضلل الناس على أعمال فنية. ممكن ترجم الكلام هذا؟
He wanted to add more things that he had to say about how like copyright and his ownership rights to his art was changed during like Biden administration and like all the like changes that happened. It's just very kind of like disheartening to see how like the US wasted 21 years of his life and he spent 10 of these years on a food strike. He destroyed his health, that destroyed his health. And then it wants to debate with him about his ownership, about his art that he made. And it's just a comment he wanted to add.
Thank you.
شكرا كتير.
أنا أقول يعني الحكومة الأمريكية ما قدرت أعمالنا الفنية، ما قدرت عمرنا اللي ضاع، لكن للأسف الشديد حتى الجمهور ما قدر أعمال الفنية، ما في تقدير حتى من الجمهور. يعني الآن بعد خروجنا الواحد يقول مثل ديفنشي، يعني عايش فقير ومات فقير، وبعد ما مات بعدين الناس صارت تدور لوحاته. احنا هكذا عايشين هنا، لوحتنا أصابها الغبار ولا أحد يدري عنها ولا أحد. يعني هذه أول فرصة ممكن الواحد قاعد يتكلم على لوحاتي. للأسف الشديد يعني ما حتى الجمهور ما قدر الضياع اللي ضيعناه 21 سنة. يعني الواحد والله عايش لا حتى محصل لقمة عيش وهو محصل.
ماشي هترجم. He's just adding that he's more also upset the fact that the US did not recognize its fault towards these people and did not even share the art that they made in their incarceration. And on top of that, nobody cared after even they were out. Now their paintings are just collecting dust, and he's just very appreciative of the fact that we're here to hear him out, talk about his art and his paintings. And he's just thankful for that and very upset about the whole situation as a whole and want to share that with us.
Thank you.
شكرا كتير.
We are going to take a break now. So you can stay on the Zoom and we will be back in about 15 minutes, or you can try to get back on if you'd like. Yeah, you would talk.
Well, welcome back, everyone. This portion of the symposium is doubling as the annual William P. Murphy Lecture at the UNC School of Law. And I first have the honor of recognizing the person for whom this lecture series is named. The Murphy Lecture Series was established by the law class of 1990 to honor Henry Brandes Distinguished Professor of Law William Patrick Murphy, who was a member of our faculty from 1971 to 1990. Each year, we bring to Chapel Hill public intellectuals, noted lawyers, and national political figures from the fields in which Bill Murphy worked, taught, and wrote: labor law, employment discrimination, and constitutional law, to share insights into the contemporary practice of law or on a cutting-edge legal issue in one of those areas. We're immensely proud of what the lecture series represents and who Professor Murphy was. and I'm so glad you've all chosen to be here. Bill Murphy was a champion of the American civil rights movement during a time when racial tensions were at their height, particularly in the Deep South. As a native-born Southerner and a young graduate of the University of Virginia Law School with a graduate law degree from Yale, Bill came to Oxford, Mississippi in 1953 to serve on the faculty of the University of Mississippi School of Law. He spoke out early and forcefully in the wake of the Supreme Court's 1954 decision in Brown versus Board of Education, bravely teaching what the Constitution and our national commitment to equal protection under the law required all to do. When he was accused of, quote, atheism, communism, integration, and subversion, he responded, "I will not tailor my teachings to satisfy any cult of crackpots, fanatics, and willful ignoramuses." His convictions did not go unnoticed by the University of Mississippi's administration, the Mississippi State Legislature, and other opponents of equal rights in the American South. State and university leaders called repeatedly for Bill's termination, and he was eventually forced to resign in 1962, despite the efforts of 121 of the law school's 182 students who signed a petition expressing their complete faith, trust, and absolute confidence in the teaching ability and integrity of Bill Murphy. Their efforts were unavailing, at least in the short run. Bill later returned to Oxford for a hero's welcome, but only after the passage of many years. Bill Murphy moved on to the University of Missouri School of Law, only to find himself again in hot water when he spoke out against what he viewed as the unconstitutional exercise of executive power by President Lyndon Johnson, who was moving the nation towards a major war in Vietnam. Bill valued academic freedom and the ability to freely voice one's convictions. He eventually found at the University of North Carolina a port in the storm. He arrived in 1971 at a place that his wife Joy so wanted him to find, a place that would keep him even when they disagreed with him. It was a place where he remained a valued colleague for the next 36 years until his death in 2007. Bill Murphy's life work was dedicated to advancing race relations and to preparing the next generation of lawyers to tackle the most challenging legal issues of the day. Many of his former students regard Bill Murphy as one of the faculty members most influential on their own lives and careers. The Murphy Lecture has brought to Carolina many distinguished guests, including our own Julius Chambers, the late U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno, Congressman John Lewis, W.J. Bill Ussery Jr., the former U.S. Secretary of Labor and mediator for the 1994 baseball strike, Elaine Jones, former Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Seth Waxman, former Solicitor General of the United States, Judge Rena Raggi of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, Harvard Law School professor Cass Sunstein, Supreme Court practitioner Tom Goldstein, and many others. This year's Murphy Lecturer, Professor Fionnuala Nialan, is University Regents Professor, holder of the Robina Chair in Public Security and Public Policy and Society, and faculty director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota Law School. She is concurrently professor of law at the Queen's University of Belfast. From 2017 to 2023, Professor Nialan served as United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. In this capacity, she worked closely with states and the United Nations to advance global human rights protections in difficult contexts. Please welcome Professor Fionnuala Nialan. You might want this.
And let's put the lights down just a bit so we can see. Let's make sure this works. Yeah, okay. We'll go back. So I'm really pleased and delighted to be here. I'm also particularly pleased and honored to have been asked to give the Murphy Lecture. He seems like a man after my own heart, a person who believes in causes, but not just believes in them, takes a whole life to actually practice those causes through one's work. So it's a real honor to be here. Actually, I'm going to have the lights go up a tiny bit because my eyesight is so bad after years of document reading that I won't see my notes. All right. So I just want to also acknowledge the importance of this conference and particularly honor those who've spent so much time putting it together. And it's no mean feat to talk about Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in the United States these days. And it's particularly important to bring the art of these men into public space and public light. And it takes a certain kinds of persistence and perseverance to pull this off. And so I really want to acknowledge Deborah and both departments who've worked so hard to make this happen. So the opening phrase or the title of this lecture is called "You Came Too Late." And it comes from the report I wrote as UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights when I was the first UN official to have access to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, since 2002. And the phrase comes actually from the sentence that men said to me as we sat down to do interviews. Almost every single detainee I spoke to said in some form or other, but many said exactly those words, "You came too late." And by you, they didn't mean the UN, they didn't mean me personally, but they meant me, the person in the blue UN jacket as UN Special Rapporteur, meaning that it would have been enormously important for the international community to have access to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba in 2002, when there were hundreds of men and boys being rendered and tortured there. But it speaks to the complexity of the visit that I got to visit with my team in February last year when only 34 men remained at the site. And so I don't want to underestimate the importance of the visit, and I'm going to talk about the report and its findings. But I also want to acknowledge that, in fact, when it mattered for international law to be able to have access to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, international law and international institutions were not given that access. But my own story with Guantanamo goes back a couple of years. I grew up in Belfast, and much of my life has been spent doing work at the interface of counterterrorism and human rights. I wrote a thesis to become a law professor that focused on exactly that intersection and was particularly interested in the ways in which exceptional courts are used to process terrorism, how we abrogate our ordinary legal processes in times of exceptions and we move to exceptionality. And in 2014, I wrote a book with my co-author, and I should say husband, on the subject of military commissions. And we were looking at the resort to exceptional measures across multiple legal systems. But first among exceptions, first among equals as regards exceptional legal systems is the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And after writing that book, I was giving some advice to some of the legal teams, and one of them suggested that I try to visit the detention facility. So this is a picture taken in 2017, just before I was appointed Special Rapporteur. I don't think they would have let me in had they known that I was about to take on this UN role. And you see, as so many of the lawyers, Mark and others, and those of you who've been there will know, you'll see the this sort of frame of camp justice, which in a way is an oxymoron, if ever there was one, on the use of the language of justice, the way the words of justice permeate a place that is so lacking in justice, that misses the kind of essential quality of justice, because as Mark noted earlier, this was a place that was designed to avoid law. This was a place that was designed to subjugate law and make it meaningless. And this is a place, in fact, where the rule of law has a meaning in a formal technical sense, but actually to those who experience life at Guantanamo has no meaning at all. And as one lawyer said to me at the time, and it stuck with me, the only way out of Guantanamo is through Guantanamo, meaning lawyers who have to play in this playpen of rules that don't make sense, contradictions that strike at the heart of things that we consider law. The only way to get through Guantanamo with a client is actually to go through it, because in some ways, there's no other way out. So I want to reflect briefly on the interface of the United Nations with the Guantanamo Bay facility. So I'll start by saying that almost as early as reports started to emerge in 2002, or even I would say right after 9/11, as we start to see a US response gearing up, UN human rights bodies, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, UN Special Procedure Mechanism, including the Special Rapporteur on Torture, we became aware that there were there was information starting to flow through the system of arrest, detention, and movement of persons outside the scope of the law. And so as those sort of stories took shape in concrete knowledge that there was a systematic practice of, first of all, rendition, so capturing people on the battlefield and then moving them to other places for interrogation and detention. As the UN started to become aware of that, the UN's human rights mechanisms gear up to ask the question of access, right? Because the first point is that we have a strong sort of long-standing rule that we're aware of these kinds of egregious breaches. The goal is to have access to places of detention. And between 2002 and 2010, when the United States had established and put in place the system at Guantanamo, UN human rights mechanisms were asking for access to the detention facility. And they were consistently denied that access. The US position was that this wasn't a place where access would be given, and that the detainees were dangerous and high value, and this was a security classified area to which we wouldn't have access. So what happened in response to that is there were a number of international law developments. One was investigations. There were a series of investigations which took place in the European space, prompted by the work of the European Parliament. But at the UN, there was a major study. So in 2010, the Human Rights Council, which is the preeminent human rights body in the UN system, it asks for 4 special procedure mandates. So these are bodies, human rights bodies established by the UN to conduct what was called a joint study on global practices. So this is when you don't have access, when you can't access prisoners or places of detention firsthand, you try to investigate from far away. So these 4 mechanisms, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, so that's the UN body that investigates allegations of arbitrary detention, that is detention without legal process. The UN Working Group on Disappearances, so again, the fact of rendition and secret detention was prompting a question, are these enforced disappearances, which are prohibited under international law? The Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur on Torture were all equally, if you want, charged by the Human Rights Council to produce a report. And this benchmark report of 2010 was the first, I think, comprehensive review of what was called practices of secret detention. And it relied heavily on some of the information that we heard about earlier, which is knowledge from the people who were figuring out that planes were moving in and out of places where they shouldn't have been moving out, knowledge that people were disappearing, and then a greater knowledge of who in fact was being held through the work of lawyers, who in fact was being held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And the joint study really tried to underline the essential point that the US was in flagrant breach of its international law obligation in these practices of both rendition, secret detention. And we could list the rights that are at issue here. Violations of the right to be free from torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, which is an absolute right under international law, prohibited by all bodies of international law, the law of war, international human rights law, international criminal law. The prohibition on arbitrary detention. So the idea is you can't hold a person without legal process. And of course, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba was an obvious abrogation of that fundamental rule, but also many other rights, the right to fair trial, the right to legal counsel, the right to family life, the right to life in the cases where men simply did not survive the rendition and torture that was meted out to them. So this is the first major report. At the same time that the Human Rights Council asked for this report, they asked for a follow-up report. And the follow-up report was intended to sort of benchmark how the US had responded to this investigation and these concrete recommendations to change its practices to be international law compliant. So when I became Special Rapporteur in 2017, no one had been able to do the follow-up. Partly it was a lack of bandwidth and capacity, partly there were other priorities in between. So in 2017, I committed to writing the follow-up report to the 2010 report. And at the same time, I was thinking about how that report could make a difference. And I was struck by the fact in the United Nations that the United States was facing what you might call a really thorny problem. If you think back to 2017, this was the high point of China's detention practices in Xinjiang. There's still detention practices in Xinjiang, but 2016, 2017 was when the world was more firmly aware of the thousands of Uyghurs, Muslims who were being put in so-called re-education centers in Xinjiang. And the US was finding itself in an interesting place because every time the United States said Xinjiang, China said Guantanamo, right? So there was this enormously difficult challenge for the United States that its legitimacy, its status as a country that could speak to human rights violations, systematic human rights violations by other countries, was fundamentally undermined. Guantanamo had proven to be an albatross, even as it is fading in the memory of Americans, even as it's not getting coverage in this country. Guantanamo remained live and visible globally. It was visible in countries' diplomatic discourse like Russia and China, but it was also really visible in an extreme way. If we looked at the practices of ISIL, Daesh, the terrorist group operating in Northeast Syria, many of the people they beheaded were wearing orange jumpsuits, not by accident, that actually Guantanamo itself became a symbol of both radicalization and a mobilization for violence across multiple parts of the world. So the US had both a legitimacy problem and it had a PR problem. And so it struck me that at the time that one of the ways that I could do this follow-up report, but also actually use the report as a way to break this logjam with the United States on its unwillingness to allow any UN access to the detention facility. So as I started writing or thinking about writing this report, I reached out to the administration at the time, which was the Trump administration. And in a way, I should say it often makes no difference who's in the White House, because mostly security policy stays the same. People think it differs, but from one president to the other, there's not a huge amount of difference on essential security matters. But at the time, so we went to the State Department, we met with State Department officials, my team and I, and at the time there wasn't an interest in pursuing a visit under the Trump administration. But that door stayed open, that crack to discussion, that idea that maybe it would be in the US's interest to allow the UN to come in was the thread that I hoped to kind of engage the administration with. Well, of course, a couple of years later, we have a change in administration. And so I went back to the White House, and my goal was really, again, to say this report, I'm going to issue this report on secret detention. And what I did in that report was track the fate of every single individual that we knew who had been transferred to Guantanamo. And the goal was actually to figure out what happened to each one of them and to test whether they had any measure of accountability. That included criminal, civil, or reparation, including psychological rehabilitation from torture. And the finding on that report, as we tracked each individual that we knew who had been transferred, was that there had been zero accountability by the United States. There's one or two cases, we think particularly of Maher Harar, the Canadian national, where Canada ended up making a reparation and apology for their association with his transfer. But in fact, the US had never apologized, remedied, accounted for, or ensured reparation to any of the men who'd been transferred. So that's not a very good news story for the United States. But my note here says that part of what I was trying to do was to say to the US, you have an independent reason to have a UN special rapporteur come visit, because what we're trying to redeem here is the principle of access to places of detention. That idea that there is no detention facility in the world to which the UN cannot have access is a really important independent principle. Whether it's Xinjiang, China, whether it's the prison where Alexei Navalny is held in, whether it's Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. If you don't allow access to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, you allow authoritarian and repressive regimes to say, why should we ever let anybody into any prison? Because you, the democracy here, are not allowing anyone into your prison. And so we had a very long, I would say, and sustained negotiation. I was really lucky. I had an all-female team of lawyers who were quite extraordinary. And Ed, who translated for you today, was my translator and came with us. And so this trust building took, I would say, over 2 years. We're happy to talk more about that, but it's all to say that when a country allows you into its most sensitive security facilities, it's got to believe that you, in fact, are going to do so in a fair, impartial, and legally robust way. And so while today, mostly what I'm going to talk about is the report's findings on the detention facility, the reports had 3 parts. The first part was committed to the victims of terrorism. And this very first picture that you see of my team and I is the weekend we started, and I see Amber was with us that weekend. The weekend we started our mission, we started it in New York, and we started it at 9/11. We got the director of the museum was enormously generous to my team and I, and took us in early morning before anybody goes into the facility, and allowed us to see the facility, which I think and how many people have been to the 9/11 museum? Okay. So it's an extraordinary, powerful place. It's also a graveyard because there are people whose bodies were never recovered. It's a place that's both a memorial site, but actually it's the place where people died and rest. And for the families, it's enormously important. And it was enormously important to us to acknowledge the 9/11 families and to address the US's legal obligations to those families. And so we started there, and part of the commitment was to meet with the 9/11 families, which we did. And I should say there's no one 9/11 families. There's lots and lots and lots of 9/11 families who range from folks who believe Guantanamo is a good and important place, and those who think it should be closed tomorrow. So it's a big spectrum of views, but the honoring the families and addressing the US government's legal obligations to them was really important. The middle part of the report is about the detention facility, and the final part of the report looks at the situation of men who were transferred or who were returned to countries of origin. So Sabri and Mansour, you've already met. They were not returned home. They were transferred resettled to other countries, but many men did return home, including, for example, large numbers of Afghans. So that's the 3 parts of the report. And the trust building was really about ensuring that the US, first of all, understood this 3-part report, but that also I would have access to the entirety of the detention facility. And so, and the lawyers know there are places you go that you can interview. But we wanted to see every single part of a standard UN operating procedure for a prison is that you can see every part of the facility and that you can interview the detainees without any interference or oversight. And so part of the conditionality of the visit was that the visit be conducted in line with those UN requirements. Now, it's worth noting that, of course, other than lawyers, there had been no one who had had access to these men other than their captors. And I think I would just say that preparing for that visit, we spent a lot of time with our lawyers. We spent a lot of time with the Center for Victims of Torture. And actually, even though I've done years of visiting prisons, it's very clear that this prison visit, meeting these men and their families, sometimes meeting their families in third countries, that it would be a different kind of visit, that the obligation was really sitting heavily on us. And it's important to say too that, like, sometimes when you walk in with a blue UN jacket, people think you're going to solve every problem in their lives, and that sometimes that they can walk out with you. And it turns out that part of the biggest challenge is a challenge of expectation, because you can walk in and you can take a story and you can spend some hours with an individual who's been detained without trial for over 20 years, but that person's not walking out with you. And it's worth noting that since we left the prison, so this is us arriving at JTF Gitmo in the morning of our visit, and only 4 men. There were 34 men there when I visited last February. There are still 30 men in that prison. So it speaks to the real enormous limits of what you can do. I want to say something about the report, and then I'm going to talk about the artwork. This is one of the, I think one of the places where we may have had a tiny little bit of influence was on the artwork. And this is the view as you leave Guantanamo. So it looks beautiful from the air, right? So there were multiple issues that we were addressing in the report. And one of the things that I wanted to do was make sure that we had sort of, you have to both address what you were seeing. There's the history of the detention facility, but also there's the here and now, right? And our goal was primarily to address the here and now. And the report is broken down into multiple sections, and I want to talk about a few of them. So the first, I think, has already been actually articulated by Mark a little bit, which is the standard operating procedures in the prison. And so, one of the things about torture is that torture is designed to break a person. And part of that is to break them down so that they are helpless, that they're unsure about everything, that nothing in the world is predictable to them. And so, for example, the standard operating procedures at Guantanamo Bay are secret. They're not shared with the lawyers. They weren't shared with me as UN Special Rapporteur, and they're not shared with the men. And what we heard in interviews with the men and with the prison guards is that actually they change all the time, from commander to commander, from year to year, from rotation to rotation. And that insecurity, that change, that unexpectedness, that you don't know what the next thing is going to look like, actually reproduces the conditions of torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment in itself. Other things were obvious. So for example, when we interviewed the men, I always ask when I visit a country that I meet all prisoners and that they're not shackled. So it doesn't matter. I've met high security detainees in many, many countries, some convicted of terrorism, some not. None of them are ever shackled. And we said to the US government, there's no reason for these men to be shackled. But the standard procedure is that the men are shackled. And again, consider the reality of the men who've been cleared for release, who've been told that they have done nothing, that they are cleared by the UN, they are not a national security threat to the United States, and yet they remain shackled in the most ordinary of things that they do, including whether it's meeting their lawyer or meeting someone like me. That one of the sort of core finding is that arbitrariness pervades every part of daily life at Guantanamo, and that arbitrariness reproduces this past of torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And one of the things the report finds is that for many of the men, the line between the past and the present is exceptionally thin. That for some, they can make this distinction, but for others, the difference between then and now is negligible and not true. The second part of the report focused on the health of these men. As anyone who's been there will tell you, these are elderly, frail, sometimes very ill men. And they're ill because they've all been tortured. And they're ill because they've been held in conditions that meet the standard of torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law. And they're also ill because they live in a place where their medical and aging needs can't be met. And so the report is absolutely forthright on the lack of availability, adequacy, and acceptability of the health provision at Guantanamo Bay, inconsistent with international law. The other outstanding point on health is that none of these men have had torture rehabilitation. A fundamental right of someone who's been tortured under international law is that you have a right to rehabilitation. And that right has been denied to all of these men. It raises, of course, some really profound questions as to whether or not you can provide torture rehabilitation in a site where torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment has been practiced. But it's clear that, that the current provision, of which there's almost none for the mental health in particular of these men, simply doesn't meet international standards. The other thing is that none of these men have right of access to their medical information or medical records. And if you're a doctor treating a victim of torture and you have no access to their medical records, you can't treat them adequately. And so both the men suffer from the lack of access to certain fundamental provisions, but in fact, even the doctors treating them can't do so adequately because they don't have the information of what happened to them. And of course, it states the obvious that notwithstanding that we met some very committed medical personnel, they all wear a uniform. They're all in the chain of command. And these are men who were tortured by people wearing those uniforms, and also tortured by people in some instances who pretended to be medical personnel in order to carry out the torture. And medical personnel were responsible for force feeding men who chose to hunger strike as their sole capacity to resist the conditions in which they found themselves in. Legal access remains hugely important, but also arbitrary at the detention facility. And lawyers are a lifeline for these men. And lawyers are often their only point of contact with the outside world. They're both lawyer and friend. And I would say the lawyering that I saw and still see is extraordinary. These are the kind of lawyers you law students want to be. These are lawyers for whom their commitment to client and their commitment to justice is a lifelong commitment. These men have been there, some of them for 20 years, and lawyers have stayed the path with them way beyond what they tell you in law school about being a transactional relationship between a lawyer and a client. This is not this is just, I actually don't have good words to describe the sort of sense of the work that these lawyers do. And of course, then there's the trials, and the report looks at the inadequacy of fair trial and looks at the way in which the United States remains in breach of its international law obligations in relation to trial. Ultimately, probably if you're only going to read one paragraph of my report, it's paragraph 49 that makes its big conclusion and says essentially that when you put all of these things together, so the report does what we might call a cumulative finding. It's when you add all of these specific things together, that the totality of these factors without doubt amounts to ongoing cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. And it may also meet in individual cases the legal torture for threshold for torture. I do acknowledge that you would need individualized determinations for each man to get to that torture requirement. That's a case by case, but the overall structural determination is that that is met. And you can imagine that that's a pretty challenging thing for the US to have to hear. Part of the reason I suspect that they invited a special rapporteur was that they thought it wouldn't end up like that. That wouldn't be the finding. And it's true, things are better than they were. They are better than they were in 2002. Nonetheless, you have to assess each moment in time as it relates to the international standard. And it's clear that the US falls well below that. So let me say something about the artwork. So one of the things, in addition to these reports that I wrote, was that I had also been communicating with the US government about its artwork policy. So I and the special rapporteur on cultural rights had decided that, it might be a good thing to actually survey all of the relevant law on the right to art and artwork for incarcerated persons, and to assess US practice against those international law standards. So we issued something, it's not a report, it's called a communication, in the months before the visit to Guantanamo. And in fact, Badr and many of the artists in today's exhibition were part of that communication. They gave their individual consent to Alexandria Santaki and I that we could intervene individually on their behalf. And really it was an attempt to illustrate that even on these, quote, soft issues, the US was falling massively behind in international law. And it's worth noting, on the morning that we arrived in Washington for the start of my visit, as we were walking into the Pentagon, and someone rushed up to us and said, "Oh, we've really good news for you." And I was like, "Oh, what?" Like, I was thinking, you've let them all go. We're not going to go. It's all over. But the good news, which is a good news story, is that the policy, the US, the DOD was announcing a policy change on the artwork. So there are lots of ways to think about that. A visit of a special rapporteur gets you some things, and artwork is low-hanging fruit. So making an announcement on the day of my visit is a good news story, and that was the story that the New York Times covered that morning. So it probably wasn't an accident that they announced the policy change that morning, but it also demonstrated what's possible, meaning that this kind of policy change is not outside of the reach of the United States government and should have happened before then. Now, the interesting question is, what does the policy mean? As much as is practicable remains a really interesting, sort of an interesting articulation. And I think that statement of yours should be tweeted loudly, because that tells us that, at least gives us some contours on what that "as soon as practicable" means. But I think the outstanding piece that we see here on the artwork is actually the historical legacy of the artwork that's been taken. So we have a large amount of artwork that still remains in the custody of the US government. This is artwork to which these torture survivors are entitled. This is artwork. This is one of the few places of solace for these men. It's also something to show for the years they spent in arbitrary detention in US custody. So one of our legal challenges, I think, is actually to get that artwork back and to start the process of both legal accountability for the taking of the artwork, as well as the symbolic importance of actually returning that work to those who created it. And again, it seems to me, in a way that people won't connect with torture, they do connect with artwork. And so one of the challenges we face is it's very difficult to make headway on what seems like the big and most important issues, like accountability for torture at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. But again, for those of us who think in human rights, human rights goals stretch in decades, not years. You don't have a short run if you're thinking about human rights change. And so it seems to me here that strategies around actually not just the promotion of art and the humanization of the men who were brought to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, but actually it's part of this wider struggle of accountability, because the two go hand in hand. It's the humanization of the men who were taken that is part and parcel of ensuring that we actually get accountability. The other thing I do want to is I got to, one of the privileges of this visit is I got to see artwork when I was there. And I think it remains extraordinarily powerful to me in talking to the men that I had the privilege of talking to as special rapporteur, how essential their artwork was to them. And so many of them, what you heard today from Sabri, who said, I couldn't leave without my artwork, was something that I heard repeated from so many of the artists when I was there. Now, that's like a Hobson's choice, right? If you're leaving and you have a choice to leave, but you don't have your artwork. And it does seem to me that at least at this level of individual relief, there's enormous relief for some of the artists that the work can now go with them. Let me close out by, I do want to say a couple of words about the repatriated and resettled men, and then I'll try to close in the next 3 minutes or so we stay on time. So the third part of this report focused on not the situations of confinement, but what happens to men when they go back. And this is an image that was taken this last October at the European Parliament, and Mansour was there in the middle of the party. But this is just, I think it's quite extraordinary to see where we are today, where we have former detainees leading the conversation, setting the agenda, articulating their stories in the halls of power. And last week, Mansour and other artists were back in Guantanamo, back in Brussels, hosting an exhibition of artwork at the European Parliament. And again, everyone you see in the front row here, there's a number of former detainees who have been resettled or returned to various parts of Europe. It's just a shift. It's not us speaking for them anymore. It's nothing about us without us, right? That the men themselves are at the heart of what happens next, and their articulation front and center of their humanity, of their legal rights, of their art, of their personhood. All of these things I think are really essential, which makes today's conversation with them, albeit with all of the limitations of technology, so utterly important. I will say that for the men who've been resettled or returned, their situation in many cases remains dire. No financial provision was made for them. They were essentially dumped in their countries of origin or their countries of transfer. None of them have had any form of torture rehabilitation. None of them have had adequate financial compensation. Many of them live in penury. Many of them live on the margins of society. Most of them live with massively high levels of US engaged security surveillance, so that wherever they go, whatever they do, whomever they talk to, they are under constant surveillance. And they live with the residual harm of having been the victims of torture, who lack acknowledgement, accountability, and reparation. So what do we have to do? And here I'll close. Well, the first thing we do is that we need to close Guantanamo. It's really clear. There's no choice. And for those, there are many people in this room in North Carolina who've been in the heart of that fight for a long time. This is a fight worth fighting for. You may be small in number, it may be off the radar screen, but it's actually one of the most important fights, because in some ways it defines the rule of law in this democracy. If there isn't accountability for US torture, the costs to this country in the long term, both nationally and internationally, are immense and I think unforgivable. The second thing is that we have to address the rights of those who've been resettled and repatriated, which includes ensuring that they have acknowledgement, torture rehabilitation, and reparation for what happened to them. The third thing is we have to release the artwork. We really do, because that is testimony to what these men have endured, but also absolutely critical to restoring their dignity. And in that regard, I think supporting the artists remain critical, and ensuring that we recognize, we see them, we affirm who they are. And I would close by saying that, you know, Guantanamo may have slipped away in many ways from the mainstream of US consciousness, but torture is really sticky. Torture is a crime that has no statute of limitations. Torture is a crime that is not forgotten. And torture doesn't go away, as Augusto Pinochet and others learned to their peril. So this is a long road to walk, but it's a road really worth walking because the stakes couldn't be higher for the rule of law. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all your words. And also thank you all for also being here with us for this last session of the night for this amazing symposium. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us again. My name is Brenda Palacios Rodriguez.
And I'm Sarah.
And we are two students from the Arts 390 Sculpture Garden Arts as a Social Action course class, and this semester with Professor Trong. And we are honored to be here today and excited to introduce you to these three inspiring voices. This panel will delve into the intersections of art, liberation, and abolition, highlighting the interdisciplinary efforts of artists leveraging their work to advance justice and abolition. It will examine how art and abolition serve as frameworks for human rights, exploring critical questions on freedom of expression and the role of art in resistance within legal contexts. Our three panelists come from diverse backgrounds and identities, all creating impactful works across multiple spaces.
Alrighty, so our first one is Aliyah Hana Hussan, and she's the Advocacy Program Manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she leads campaigns on Guantanamo detention, profiling of Muslim communities, and accountability for war crimes. She frequently visits Guantanamo to meet with CCR's clients, forging crucial connections for her advocacy work. Her role extends beyond traditional legal realms. She organizes events, collaborates with artists, and engages with international human rights bodies. Her writing, including pieces in Teen Vogue and contributions to books like Obama's Guantanamo Stories from an Enduring Prison, amplifies the voices of those affected by injustice. She's a dedicated champion for human rights, demonstrating unwavering commitment and creativity in her pursuit of justice.
Our second speaker is Erin Hughes, a multifaceted artist, activist, and organizer, a teacher, and Iraq War veteran whose work is deeply rooted in a profound exploration of poetics, connections, and moments of beauty amid personal and collective traumas. Erin's journey is a testament to the transformative power of art and activism. Erin's deployment experiences in 2003 to Kuwait and Iraq compelled him to confront issues of militarism and dehumanization through his art. Upon returning to the University of Illinois in 2005, he began using painting as a tool to deconstruct his military experience, paving the way for a remarkable career that merges art with social justice. Erin is a part of the Iraq Veterans Against the War, IVAW, advocating for war reparations and pioneering projects like Warrior Writers and Combat Paper, merging political and aesthetic concerns from Operation Recovery to the Tea Project. Erin's works dismantle oppression and celebrates our shared humanity, inviting reflection on a world of conflict and beauty.
And our last is Amber Ginsberg, a Chicago-based professor and artist at the University of Chicago's Department of Visual Arts. Ginsberg's artistic practice revolves around creating site-generated projects and social sculptures that intertwine historical narratives with contemporary contexts. Drawing from her background in craft, She explores the intersections of material and social histories, often collaborating with experts across diverse fields such as botany, political activism, and science fiction. Recently, Ginsberg has shifted her focus towards imagining alternative futures that prioritize human survival, inspired by past feminist strategies like collective action and equity politics. Through her large-scale sculptural forms, she invites audiences to engage actively in thinking through the making of her work, blurring the boundaries between human and non-human agency in her narrative-driven practice. We are so honored to welcome these three remarkable changemakers whose creative endeavors intersect with urgent social issues. Please join us in giving a big welcome to these amazing visionaries.
Hello, Aaliyah, can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't hear the clapping. So I'm ready to start if you're ready.
That is wonderful. Let's see. Just give us a moment as we figure out the volume situation.
I can. Can you hear me? Is that
Yay,
better?
okay, now we can hear you.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, please go ahead. I know it's weird because you probably can't see any of the audience, but we can see you. So thank you so much for joining us. You can go ahead and get started.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind invitation. I can see 4 lovely chairs in front of me, but I know that many of you are there, so hello. And I just want to say I'm so honored to be speaking here today alongside comrades and colleagues whose work I deeply admire. I'm particularly honored to be in a program with so many of these incredible artists. It's truly a gift to be able to hear directly from survivors. We have so much to learn from them, and it's only with their guidance and collaboration that we can really build a world without Guantanamo. And I'm just sorry I'm not able to be there in person to see the exhibition, mostly because I love watching people engage with this work for the first time. Working with Guantanamo artists and playing a small role in sharing this work over the years has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my career. Guantanamo and art have been closely connected for me since I started my work at the Center for Constitutional Rights 14 years ago. On my first trip to Guantanamo to meet with CCR clients, one of them brought artwork into the meeting to share with us. That was my first lesson in understanding how beauty can emerge in even the darkest of places. And that art, sorry, did someone say something? Okay, sorry, I'll keep going. And that art was a form of resistance. In a place designed to isolate them from the rest of the world, these artists have, sorry, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Okay, sorry, I'll just ignore the feedback. In a place designed to isolate them from the rest of the world, these artists have found a way to connect with all of you. They may not be allowed to set foot in the United States, but their works, expressions of love, resilience, and hope, can transcend these borders and oppressive systems. And this is truly remarkable. So there's a lot to say about Guantanamo. There's a lot that has been said. So in my time, I just want to share a little bit about some of the strategies that have been used to challenge indefinite detention and what more we can do to not only close the prison, but to truly abolish Guantanamo and all that it entails. So for as long as the prison at Guantanamo has existed, so has the movement to resist it. The resistance has taken place in many corners of the world, in courtrooms, in the media, on the streets, in art museums and universities, and within the prison itself. It is at these intersections where I see my work as an advocate. It's also at these intersections that our work is its most powerful, using all the tools that we have. The organization where I work, the Center for Constitutional Rights, has played a central role in the legal battle against the prison. Creative lawyering on behalf of men the government went to great lengths to demonize, keep powerless, and hide from public scrutiny is itself a form of storytelling. And creating connections between the people imprisoned and the outside world has and continues to be an act of resistance. In the days and months following 9/11, CCR positioned itself between US government policies and immigrant, Muslim, Black, and Brown communities under attack at home and abroad. Our response to the so-called war on terror built on our own rich history of litigating against the US carceral state, imperialist projects, and war. Our challenge to governmental abuse at Guantanamo actually began a decade earlier in the 1990s, when the Bush and Clinton administrations used the naval base to detain Haitians who were seeking asylum but were prevented from entering the US because they were HIV positive. Former CCR attorney and President Michael Ratner challenged those detentions and saw even then that the government had argued that Guantanamo was a law-free zone. He knew firsthand how important it would be for CCR to lead the fight against the post-9/11 detentions there. As others have shared, the US chose Guantanamo precisely because it was considered to be outside the law. So challenging that premise was an act of resistance. My colleagues in the network of pro bono legal advocates fought to protect the rights of the people in prison there and ensure that Guantanamo was neither outside the law nor public consciousness. Lawyers would spend years litigating the question of whether their clients could even access the courts at all. Mark mentioned the Boumediene ruling, and I'm sure others have as well. This set the course for the influx of attorneys into the prison and the litigation of individual cases that continues today. But as lawyers fought within the courtroom, they also thought outside the box. Litigation has never been the only vehicle to fight for justice. It can't be. Organizing within Guantanamo is part of a rich history of protest within prisons and detention facilities. For the men to survive at and through Guantanamo is to reject the government's primary aim to strip them of their humanity. So I see all the ways in which men at Guantanamo have asserted their dignity, expressed themselves, and created community within and outside of the prison as forms of resistance. Two advocacy efforts that have dramatically shaped politics, culture, and narrative were led by the men themselves: hunger strikes and art making. Mansour, Badr, and Sabri shared more about the art making, so I'll just touch briefly on hunger strikes. One of our clients, Tariq Bauda, engaged in a long-term hunger strike, an act that caused prison authorities to label him non-compliant. For that, he was kept in solitary confinement with limited access to recreation time or comfort items and was force-fed twice a day. Despite the cruelty he endured daily, Tariq never relented. "My hunger strike has become my shield, which will protect me," he wrote. "The hunger strike has nourished in me the sense of resistance and reminded me that the unjust cannot manipulate me as he pleases. He will not succeed in controlling me or controlling my destiny, for I am the one who controls it," Tariq wrote. His case rose to prominence as a critical test in the Obama administration. Litigation, New York Times editorials, public actions, all centered on his struggle. If the Obama administration couldn't transfer a man who was cleared for release and whose body at just 75 pounds was failing, how could it possibly close Guantanamo? So Tariq vowed to continue his hunger strike until he was reunited with his family, which he did for 9 years, until he was finally transferred home to Saudi Arabia. On a larger scale, we saw the collective power and action when the men engaged in a mass hunger strike in 2013 to protest Obama's inaction in Guantanamo and the lack of transfers. The demands of more than 200 men acting as one brought renewed urgency and refocused attention back to the prison. Despite the deteriorating conditions and retaliation they faced, their spirits persevered. I feel stronger than ever, our clients each expressed in meetings and letters, even when it was clear that their health was suffering. They were leading this effort, and those of us on the outside were using our respective tools to amplify their voices in the media, before the United Nations, and Washington, D.C., so they could eventually reach the one person that mattered. President Obama heard their message loudly and clearly and recommitted to transferring men out of the prison. Not only was the mass protest a pivotal movement that led to clear policy changes, but it also brought new life and focus to advocacy efforts. One of the hardest things about this work has been to bridge the gap between those who are most impacted by Guantanamo and the rest of us. So at the time, 2013, the outpouring of stories and voices helped advocates on the outside build momentum towards our goal of closing the prison and bringing the issue of Guantanamo together with other social justice campaigns. With grassroots organizations such as Witness Against Torture, many of you have seen the orange jumpsuits, that's Watt and their peers. We brought the men into our public advocacy as much as we could. Demonstrations and vigils to mark the January 11th anniversary of Guantanamo's opening, fasts for justice, street theater, and art. Always persistent and always creative, This grassroots coalition has spread the Close Guantanamo campaign throughout the United States. At the height of the mass hunger strike, activists sat through a congressional briefing, holding up photos of men detained to remind decision makers of the people actually impacted by their policies. Activists have painted and held giant banners with their faces of our clients and recited their words and dreams outside of the White House, in New York City's Times Square, and anywhere else they could be heard. I'm going to show, hopefully, if it works, a very short video or an excerpt of a video. This is a video of our colleagues at Witness Against Torture who were reciting words from one of our clients, Fahad Ghazi, a cleared Yemeni who was detained at Guantanamo. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Okay, I think I've got it.
We welcome you. Thank you for taking this time out of your day to listen to a story, a human story about a man named Fahad Ghazi, who at 17 years old was taken to Guantanamo Bay prison and for the last 13 years has spent his life there. Despite having a wife and child, a daughter, a community, a family who loves him and who misses him.
I want to have the honor to speak out in my own voice and reach you directly, you who are thinking people, and I want to say thank you. Thank you for caring. You are willing to view me as a human being, and that is something so precious to me. I am not ISN 026, that is the government's number. My name is Fahad Abdullah Ahmed Ghazi. I am a human being, a man who is loved and who loves.
Okay, hopefully folks heard that. I just wanted to share that excerpt as an example of some of the simple but really powerful ways that people have tried to amplify the voices coming out of Guantanamo, and it's also given us a lot of news to be able to share back to our clients when they were detained. So grassroots organizations throughout the world have spent the last 2 decades fulfilling this important role to bear witness and demand change. So now it's incredible to see so many former detainees speaking out, participating in panels, telling their stories. They are literally bridging the gap between the inside and the outside. They give a face and a voice to Guantanamo, and they are the best positioned to articulate the world that they want to see and deserve. It's also been important to position Guantanamo in a larger struggle for social justice and accountability. This is not new. Just to give you an example, around the same time that I've been talking about 2013, 2014, the UN Committee Against Torture reviewed the United States human rights record, and NGOs and directly impacted individuals and survivors of US torture testified before the committee, US delegation, staffers, and the public in Geneva. For the first time in its history, the committee heard directly from one of the men who had been tortured at Guantanamo, Murat Kurnaz, a Turkish citizen and legal resident of Germany who was detained for 5 years. His lawyer, Bahar Azmi, is the Center for Constitutional Rights legal director, and accompanied him on that trip. Many others shared their stories too, including youth activists with We Charge Genocide, a grassroots organization working to expose police violence in Chicago, and the parents of Michael Brown, a young Black man who was murdered by police in Ferguson, Missouri. This was just one of many examples of the power in bringing different movements together to learn and build from one another. For any organizers in the crowd, you know that this kind of work involves a lot, building trust, engaging in real meaningful solidarity, and for us, finding ways to make an issue like Guantanamo accessible through language and messaging that resonated with people. So with each day, year that passes and Guantanamo remains open, it becomes clear to me that we must continue expanding our movement and build our collective power. So during the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo in 2022, there was really a time for reflection on the last 2 decades and also to strategize how to move forward. It was a time of bold demands for decarceration and the redistribution of government resources of support rather than criminalizing communities. There was a necessary reframing of the conversations around safety and security. The narrative that Guantanamo is an aberration and exceptional was once effective in rallying widespread opposition to its existence. But now It obscures just how connected it is to other systems of oppression and how the men detained see themselves alongside others who are incarcerated. I'm sure you've heard others say this. There's no doubt that Guantanamo is unique and unprecedented in many ways, but we also see clearly now that it's an extreme manifestation of the same power and harm that makes up the rest of the US carceral system. And I think you'll hear more from Aaron and Amber about this in their remarks. In doing this, we can also see connections with other freedom struggles and better understand how we might build together and across movements. For so long, Guantanamo has been situated in the national security or rule of law sphere, but Guantanamo is a racial justice and social justice issue. It is the most expensive prison in the world, and no high-level government official has been held accountable for the US torture program. So these issues have to be included in the broader conversation about abolition, state violence, and accountability. And we also have to redefine what closure means. Yes, the prison should close, but real closure means so much more. The government must meaningfully address the grave harm it has caused, including the racist and xenophobic and anti-Muslim sentiment that Guantanamo's existence continues to perpetuate to this day. The US must bring an end to endless war, dismantle the terrorism framework and ideologies that underpin war, detention, and impunity, and provide victims of the US torture program with redress. Guantanamo must close, and nothing like it can ever be constructed again. That is the true meaning of closure and many other things too. So I'll just leave you with this, something that I have to keep reminding myself, and I love conversations like this because it's inspiring, and it just reminds me how many people care about this issue. A world without Guantanamo is possible, it is necessary, and it is ours if we're able to dream it into existence and continue to use all of the tools we have to resist. So anyway, thanks so much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Aaron and Amber, who I've worked together with for years, and I'm so grateful for their work and contributions.
What a lot of tough acts to follow. This presentation, thank you, Aaliyah, is really based on many connections made over the past 10 years of sitting and having tea and difficult conversations. It is humbling to go after all of these speakers, and particularly the artists themselves, and Aaliyah, miss you being here. A special thank you, of course, to our organizers, Hong An, Deborah. This is really profound.
So what we're going to start off is, let's see if this will play.
I think I might be able to.
Oh. Play and stop.
Witnesses in time to human suffering, struggle, and health. Congratulations to Dr. Edmond. When you got the argument, reparation, it does with the Edmond. It cleans the room. And you know that she places most. It did come to a citizen. So we gotta keep fighting, we gotta keep pushing.
So We heard earlier about the exceptional, and this talk is about remaking the exceptional. And we begin with a quote from Angela Davis. If we consider the various forms of violence linked to the practice of imprisonment, circuits of violence linked to one another, then we begin to see that the extraordinary has some connection to the ordinary. What is routinely accepted as necessary conduct by prison guards can easily turn into the kind of torture that violates international standards, especially under the impact of racism. Angela Davis, Abolition Democracy.
The police were able to do whatever they wanted to us. It's probably the same thing in Guantanamo Bay. The only difference is where it's at. Anthony Holmes, Chicago police torture survivor. And this is the shocking part for me. When I saw what happened to George Floyd, I had encountered it several times as a former prisoner of the US. An American soldier put his knee on my neck and another had a knee on the lower part of my back. And I said, literally, I can't breathe. Mozambique, Guantanamo torture survivor.
The US security carceral state perpetuates a lineage of violence that can be traced like a constellation. One line extends towards Mozambique at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. Another line stretches out to Anthony Holmes in Chicago's Area 2 Police Headquarters, and yet another line points in the direction of George Floyd in Minneapolis.
Speaking about their experiences, Chicago police torture survivor Anthony Holmes and Guantanamo torture survivor Mozambique draw direct connections between international military operations and local policing. They contradict the assumed narrative that torture and extralegal imprisonment in Guantanamo is an aberration in US policy. Instead, their words highlight that the military prison at Guantanamo, entering its 22nd year of operation, is not exceptional. Rather, it's an inheritance, a part of interconnected history.
Activist Joseph Beuys once remarked, "To make people free is the aim of art. Therefore, art, for me, is a science of freedom. This science of freedom manifests through the different media and technologies, poems, songs, paintings, direct actions, mobilizations, etchings on styrofoam cups, acts that truly are exceptional. The resistance efforts of torture survivors, their strength to speak out, their creativity, and their will to make art and poetry despite, fuel these technologies of liberation, inspire movements, and inform remaking the exceptional."
Shakir Amir, they fight for peace. Peace, they say. Peace of mind, peace on earth, peace of what kind? I see them talking, arguing, fighting. What kind of peace are they looking for? Why do they kill? What are they planning? Is it just talk? Why do they argue? It's so simple. Is it so simple to kill? Is this their plan? Yes, of course. They talk, they argue, they kill. They fight for peace. Response artwork, Michael Sullivan, After They Fight for Peace, 2021. These artworks and poems are in conversation across US carceral systems and art and poetry made in Guantanamo.
Michael Sullivan, we just mentioned, is at the maximum security prison at Stateville Prison, and Johnny Taylor as well, intertwined. We have chosen each other, standing strong, sharing stability, firmly fighting freedom's fight. If we should lose, we will heal. Our very blood will congeal. Upon the systemically dysfunctional planet, should we win, we will show unity, commonality, compassion, communal combat can change circumstances. We have chosen each other. We are forever intertwined. And then this is by Ghalib al-Bahani, particularly unique because many of the works coming out of Guantanamo do not show human figures. And it's very intimate touch. It's so personal and so beautiful. Okay. Kapo Buon, what kind of spring is this? Where there are no flowers and the air is filled with a miserable smell. That's by Muslim Dost, and this is a teacup, part of the Tea Project.
Devon Terrell, no wayward sailor. Shadows have whispered doubt along the passage. Light cannot be seen beyond the dark. I grip and brace, prepared for battle. Chaos is braved by will and test of heart. My balance is challenged when crashed into. I rock and tilt through flood and storm. I point to every star that guides me to fulfill the purpose for which I'm born. At last, the winds caused me to float adrift. I gave in and rode torrential waves. Through toothsome rapids and blinding mists, I found myself battered and all too scathed. Because I once charted another's map, I was washed ashore to banks of empty promise. That's when I discovered, maybe, perhaps, the treasure I sought was love, respect, and self-honor. I tossed overboard the weight of all the baggage, pulled up the anchors that once held me down. Now I enjoy the sun shining along my voyage, shipping pieces of my heart around the world. This land and sea belong to only time. Every breath is just a passport stamp. What if we sailed life with child's eyes? What if we sailed life being more than man? Response to Sabri al-Qurashi, Untitled, 2012.
Making inside. We would sing, dance, recite poetry, tell each other stories. We were in open cages. In one block, there were 48 different nationalities. I could hear songs in Arabic, in English, in French, in Pashto, in Farsi, Russian, Urdu, in different languages. So beautiful. Detainees wrote poems about the detention, the sea, life, longing, suffering, and so on. Making friends, we would show each other dances of Afghanistan, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and so on. Imagine detainees, 48 different countries, singing one beautiful song. Mansour Daifi.
The songs of freedom washing over Adaifi and this sea of resistance are reflected in the brushstrokes and marks of many of the works depicted at sea done by artists in Guantanamo. We learned that detainees' access to art supplies and time to paint and draw was restricted, which we also heard today directly. Artists were searched both entering and leaving their lessons, and at times they were chained to the chair. Despite all these obstacles, the will to create persisted.
When I paint, I try to escape all the difficulties and hardships here and go to this place which relaxes me. Guantanamo was really difficult. Even during those difficult times, during the hunger strikes, and during hardships in the camp, I would go to art classes. Through painting, I could transform the atmosphere of the jail. If I was working on a nature scene or a landscape or an ocean, I could feel myself inside the painting itself. It was my way of escaping jail and detention. So yes, art helped me to survive there and still does today. Sabri.
Still, other forms of resistance emerge from the work surrounding this remaking the exceptional. For example, remembrance and memorialization. In a series of bas-reliefs that we got to hear from Mark, the paintings by Khalid Qasim, who is still detained. I want to say that again and again, who is still detained. 9 ever-glowing candles against a Black background represent each of the 9 men who died while being held in Guantanamo. This is a collaboration that we were really honored to do in the Remaking the Exceptional show that we, through lawyers, negotiated with, showing the 9 cups we have for the men who died together with the 9 candles. Resistance is cumulative, like water pooling these works, words, poems, paintings, actions, and habits collect and overflow. Waters, like people's movements bound by solidarity, rise and fall, swell and calm, but always flow in the direction of freedom.
Reparations. I think you can go on to some series. Oh, yeah.
No.
Sorry. Reparations. Reparations is like the F-bomb, Tanya said. When you drop the R word, reparations, it does what the F-bomb does. It quiets a room. You can be in a place with the most progressive liberals and you say reparations, and it's like gasp. Latanya Jennifer Sublet.
Reparations are a gesture towards righting wrongs and a pathway to healing. If reparations are a technology, it's one that needs further research and development. It needs practice. It needs tending. The time I spent at Guantanamo was the most difficult time of my life. I was tortured physically and psychologically, and for many years subjected to degrading and humiliating treatment without any rights. When released from Guantanamo, I was sent to Algeria in an airplane, shackled and blindfolded, and never received any remedy of any kind for the years that I lost, not even an apology, Jamal Azmeh.
As we learned from our conversation with torture survivors, public acknowledgement and apology are essential, a first step towards repairing injustice. Like poetry, the official language of apology and reparations begins in the imagination. Words and ideas that can be shaped into legal language and concretized into legal documents.
Whereas the city of Chicago acknowledges that former Chicago Police Commander John Burge and detectives under his command systematically engaged in the acts of torture, physical abuse, and coercion of African-American men and women at Area 2 and 3 Police Headquarters from 1972 through 1991.
Working with the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial's co-founder and activist lawyer Joey Mogul of the People's Law Office drew up a speculative reparations ordinance employing the terms whereas and hereby, thus enacting this legal language for the purpose of apology and acknowledging wrongdoing. The speculative ordinance begins, as we just read, continuing its transitions to include multiple hereby clauses detailing and demands for recompense and restitution, the action of apology beyond simple naming injustice.
The City of Chicago hereby issues a formal apology to the torture survivors, their family members, and other affected individuals and communities on behalf of the City of Chicago for the violations and harm incurred by these torture practices.
Hoping to build on this ordinance and the vision of it proposes, in 2016, the Tea Project held a date of imagining justice and reparations with activists who fought for the Burge reparations and those working for justice for the people imprisoned and tortured at Guantanamo. The day was spent learning about the history of people's demands for reparation and imagining a citizens' reparation campaign for Guantanamo survivors. Many of the people who participated in that day are featured in the Remaking Exceptional, their ideas and voices joining a louder public chorus of demands and dreams by Guantanamo torture survivors.
Can you click to the next slide? Oh, I'll read this one. Whereas the United States government acknowledges that it systematically engaged in the act of torture through physical and psychological violence and indefinite detention of people imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base between 2002 and the present. And
like reparations, I'll hereby issue a formal apology to the torture survivors, their family members, and the others affected individuals and communities on behalf of the City of Chicago for violations of harm incurred by those torture practices. Hereby issues a formal apology to Guantanamo Bay survivors, their families, members, and others affected individuals and communities on behalf of the United States of America for the violations of harm incurred by those torture practices.
I just want to say that this speculative reparations ordinance from Chicago became law, and Chicago is the first city in America to recognize racially motivated violence. Like reparations, the abundant flowers painted in Guantanamo spring from a stark reality, propose something new, beautiful, colorful, and alive. These flowers resist and transform the violence, offering a different route that stretches out towards restorative justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you so much, Aaliyah, as well, who joined us through Zoom. Unfortunately, we won't have enough time for a Q&A session, but I'll pass it on to Professor Chong, and thank you all so much.
Wow, all of you just, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for all of you just for staying and like joining us for this long, really intense day. I feel really, just overwhelmed a bit because that was super powerful way to end. And I feel like I have so many thoughts and questions, but I'm also just sitting with like the beauty and poetry that you just presented us in a really powerful gesture that kind of perfectly brings together really two important strands of this symposium and the exhibition, which is really to think about art not just as an essential practice as humans, but also the ways that it changes us as viewers and can actually impact policy. And your talk just beautifully kind of brought all those strands together. So really grateful. I'm just going to say a few words. First, to acknowledge Scott barrier. The person in the corner without whom we would not have been able to do this at all. So thank you so much, and for putting together a really, dealing with a really complicated technical setup. So really appreciate all of your work, Scott. I also want to just acknowledge my collaborator, Deborah. A huge round of applause for Deborah for really this entire project was her idea. She came to me in maybe an act of just losing her mind in a moment of wanting to collaborate with an artist. But I appreciate so much the trust that you had in me to really, pull this together with you. I learned so much from you, from your students, from joining the classes that we were able to join in the law clinic. And I feel really transformed by this process and just am really grateful. So thank you.
Also just wanted to give you a book. Thank you. This is the book we're reading from.
Oh. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you again, Deborah. I also have to say that, Deborah really worked really hard on the really hard parts of the logistics of this, one of which was paying the artists. And I mention this because paying artists is really not secondary to what this is also about, because art is essential, it's labor, it's work, and the meaning that is made from artists is recognized through that very simple gesture of being respected through payment. And she worked really hard to make this happen. And again, it is connected to the entire kind of concept, all the concepts that we're thinking about in terms of art as an essential act, an essential creative act that's important to understanding who we are as humans, and to really, it functions as a way to establish who we are, how we exist in this world. And I'm really grateful that you pushed that through, but also is, again, so important to thinking about how we are trying to really bring this work to an audience, but really thinking holistically. And that's really what we're thinking about in terms of art as social action, and thinking about all the different ways that art functions in a system that also includes our system, our economies. And I just went off the cuff, so now I have to try to figure out where I'm at. But again, essential to what we wanted to connect here is the foundational idea that art matters. It's labor, it's work, art is an act of creation that's central to how we define what it means to be alive and what it means to be human. The US government and other violent states understand this well. This is why they suppress it, why they destroy it in violent acts of war. And central to what we hope to communicate and connect here is that the Guantanamo is not exceptional. It's a part of a long, violent, racist, and most currently war on terror. It's colonial war on terror that has a long legacy which continues today. And the dehumanization of Arab people through an erasure and suppression of art and culture is connected to also why we're witnessing a Palestinian genocide committed by the Israeli state and aided by the US government right now. So what we learn over and over again is that there is a limit to the law. Repressive states commit crimes and are not held accountable, but narratives, stories about people, about the world are central to how public knowledge and understanding shifts. And this public knowledge changes the world, both in the texture of how we see the world, but can literally change policy and can impact the law. So the incredible work by the artists featured in our exhibition they teach us about ourselves and teach us that liberation is truly inextricable from art. So thank you for joining us today.